Dark clouds roamed the wide sky, gray and brooding, as Jon Snow stood upon a rise of hard-packed snow, overlooking what had once been the territory north of the Wall. The chill wind raked across his cheeks, turning them raw and red, but he scarcely noticed. He had grown accustomed to that bracing cold, had come to rely on its sharpness to keep his senses honed and his doubts at bay. Ghost lingered at his side, silent as the drifts around them, ears alert for anything that dared stir in the twilight. The dire wolf's white fur seemed to meld with the world of ice, but his crimson eyes glowed bright with fierce devotion. Jon rested a gloved hand on Ghost's head, gently scruffing behind the ears. Even that small movement felt monumental. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow breath of the freezing air into his lungs. It carried the brine of the distant sea to the east, the faint scent of distant pine forests to the south, and the iron tang of his own purpose. For weeks he had wandered between the wildling camps, listened to their stories, and observed the changes time had wrought on this once forbidden land. A sense of restlessness had beset him, a churn in his soul that would not still. He knew it was not only the memory of long-ago battles that caused this stir, but something deeper, something that had been building in him ever since he realized the old way, the old realms, were shattered beyond repair. There was a longing in his heart for something neither exactly northern nor wholly free folk, but a melding of both. The South, he imagined, had grown distant from the North's plight yet again, and though Sansa now ruled as queen in the North, it was a precarious peace. He thought of Winterfell, that ancestral home he had once believed he had no right to claim. A swirling mixture of homesickness and duty filled him, teased him, beckoned him with a half-formed dream. He felt Tormund's presence before he heard the crunch of boots on snow. The big wildling approached quietly. Snow clung to his thick red beard and furs. Jon kept his gaze forward as Tormund stepped up beside him, matching Jon's stance, surveying the world at the crest of that hill. A small cluster of tents and huts lay scattered at the base, smoke curling upward. Dozens of men, women, and children of the free folk made their lives there. Beyond them, rocky outcroppings, and a scattering of hardy brush, dotted the tundra that stretched to the horizon. "You're far too quiet, Jon Snow," Tormund said at last, voice gruff. "Means you're either brooding or thinking something so daft that even that direwolf of yours can't pull you back." Jon opened his eyes to the endless wintry scape. "I've been wondering if everything we suffered was just for the living to go on ignoring each other again. Like we used to do. We fought together, died together, and now each side is drifting back to their old ways. I've seen it in the eyes of some free folk, how they fear the return of old misunderstandings and lords from the south. I've heard rumblings from the few northern clans who still come this far, how they call the free folk barbarians. It's as if the long night taught us nothing." "Inatani." "Dumb." Tormund spat onto the ground and brushed a hand across his mouth. "We're free folk, but we're no fools. We can be just as stubborn, I'll grant you that. But if there's been anything hammered into my skull, it's that you're not like the rest of them kneelers. You're not all the way one of us either. You're somewhere in between." Jon laughed softly, though his eyes remained somber. "That's just it. In the end, maybe that's what the realm needs. Some kind of balance. A place that isn't purely the North, or purely the free folks' domain, but something that recognizes we share this land." "Nedzene. And how do you propose we do that, eh?" Tormund asked, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "You tried the old southern ways. Didn't see much success at King's Landing. They turned their backs on you after everything. Sent you back north to let you vanish in the snow." Jon's gloved hands twitched, but there was no bitterness in his voice when he replied, "I wasn't ready. Not truly. I had too much burden, too much confusion. I was bound by all the lines we were taught, kings and queens, lords and ladies, us and them. But after I came north, after being among the free folk for so long, I see another path. We don't have to be one way or the other. We can make a new realm. The best of both worlds." He paused, turning at last to face Tormund. "The question is, would the free folk choose to follow me if I say we'll declare our own kingdom? Not in the name of the Iron Throne, not in the name of Winterfell, but a kingdom for all who call this land their home. A kingdom of ice and fire." Nandesekaru. Tormund, let out a low whistle. That's quite a grand notion. And you think you can hold it against the power in the south, or even your sister's rule in the north? John folded his arms tightly across his chest and inhaled the biting wind. I don't wish for war, or to cause trouble for Sansa Tiao. I only wish to protect everyone here, protect all that we fought so hard to save. Too many men died because of the old divisions. This land is a place where the free folk can live as they see fit. But we must also be prepared to defend ourselves should anyone from the south try to seize it again. The north might not disturb us, so long as we remain peaceful. But the rest? There are lords in the south who'd like to think the wildlings are still a threat, or that the scattered remnants of the Night's Watch can be used to control us. I won't let that happen again. Nestor. A silence settled between the two men, filled by the hiss of the wind across the barren tundra. Ghost gave a small chuff, as though urging them onward. Tormund looked into Jon's face, reading it in that canny way he had. We fought a war for survival. Then we survived. But survival alone isn't enough for you, is it? You want something bigger. Jon bent down to give Ghost a gentle pat, watching how the direwolf's ears flicked in response. If we do nothing, old patterns will repeat. I don't want to be king in the north. That's Sansa's place. I certainly don't want to claim the Iron Throne. That belongs to whomever is left to scrap over it. But here, at the edge of the world, something new can be born. A promise the old kingdoms never kept. Nes. Tormund rubbed at his bearded jaw, snow crunching underfoot as he shifted his weight. Well, Jon Snow, you've always been good at the impossible. I'll gather the leaders of the free folk. At the very least, they'll want to hear your words, might roll their eyes, or they might see that spark you've got. You know how it is. We respect strength. We respect truth. If you can speak honestly to them, many will follow. Jon turned and regarded the man who had once been his enemy, then his friend. He laid a hand on Tormund's shoulder. Thank you. I don't know where this will lead, but I have to try. I know. They stood there a while longer, side by side, letting the cold wind whip at their cloaks. Jon's mind churned with images. The free folk's fierce independence. The families hidden in the forests that had grown behind the crumbling wall. The black uniformed men of the Night's Watch reduced to a paltry few. And beyond that, the vague memory of duty that clung to him like a second skin. He wondered if Sansa had foreseen such a turn, if she would accept an independent domain above her own, or consider it an affront. He thought of Arya, likely off on her own adventures. Perhaps one day she would sail far enough to hear tales of a new kingdom ruled by her half-brother, or cousin, or whatever the complicated truth made them now. Night fell quickly in these latitudes, and soon the world was awash in pale moonlight and the shimmering glow of far-distant stars. Huddled inside the encampment below, Jon found himself near the biggest fire at the settlement's center. A circle of men and women, clad in thick furs, ringed the flames, their faces flickering orange with each gust of wind. The smoke drifted upward to the cold black sky, drawing watery eyes from everyone and forcing them to blink often. Jon sat on a chunk of wood, Ghost resting beside him, muzzle on paws. He felt stares upon him from every direction. Ever since he had revealed his desire to bring everyone together, the free folk had looked at him differently, an air of expectancy in their gazes, a hush in their voices when they spoke to him. Tormund, ever the diplomat in his own gruff way, had told them Jon would call a council soon. But tonight, it was only a small gathering. An older woman with wild gray hair and lines etched deep around her eyes broke the silence. "You've seen more than your share of fights, Crow," she said, using the old term for Night's Watch men. "Not with malice, but habit. We lost many to the whites in the cold. Many families are gone. And now you want to speak of forging a new kingdom up here?" Jon nodded. "It's not for me alone to decide. But yes, that's what I want." The old realm was battered. We all were. Instead of letting our future be decided by old lords who fear us, or by southern politics that disregard us, we can create a place we can defend. A place that belongs to both the free folk and those who have joined us. "No, sir." Murmurs rippled around the fire. One man spat in the snow. Another, scratched at the hide of a deer, draped across his shoulders. A few coughed into their fists, choked by the smoke. Tormund, standing at Jon's left, looked at him pointedly. Jon knew Tormund wanted him to speak from the heart, the same way Jon had led them when the White Walkers bore down on them. Out here, in the swirl of wind and starlight, only honesty mattered. He stood, letting the flames cast dancing shadows across his face. I have walked with you beyond the wall. I've fought side by side with you to save the realm of the living. You've cared for your families while the rest of the Seven Kingdoms turned a blind eye. You've lost children, parents, friends. I lost my brothers of the Night's Watch. And in some ways, I lost my family. All that remains now is the chance to protect what's left. A kingdom that acknowledges no iron throne, and no traditions that bind us away from each other. We could build it here, with our own hands. We could raise new halls, gather behind new walls if we must, but open them to anyone who recognizes our laws. We shape those laws together, based on the best of what we know. Free folk ways, northern ways, ways that serve us all. Damertrasen, Elbegn. He paused, meeting the eyes of each person around the fire. Though the air was frigid, sweat clung to his temples from the heat of the flames. I'm not forcing anyone. If I have to build it alone, I will. But the truth is, I can't do this by myself. It requires all of you, and more besides. You must decide if you trust me. If I fail you, then cast me out, and I'll go. But if you want a future where we're not pressed between the Southern Lords and the creeping threats that might still haunt this land, I beg you to consider this path. Bai. The night pressed close, as though holding its breath. Then the old woman nodded slowly. You are a strange crow, Jon Snow. You gave your life once to bring us here safely. Some say you died and came back. Others say you're some sort of half-ghost yourself. I don't much know about that, but I do know you speak true. The free folk can handle ourselves, but these are different times. My nephew lost his wife and baby to a Southern Lord's raiders years ago. The man had come searching for wildling trophies to show off. If we can be strong enough that they never dare such a thing again, I'll listen to your counsel. And if it means we share food, medicine, trade, well, that can't be a bad thing. Magnadin, Dandawilniske. A few others muttered in agreement. A large man with a scar crossing his nose barked. If there are enough of us behind you, maybe even those black brothers that remain will join. I hate those crows, but I hate the Southern armies more. A slow understanding began to settle. Jon exhaled, relief mingling with the weight of what came next. Tormund grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. The gathered free folk were wary, but curiosity and a flicker of hope gleamed in their eyes. The old ways were dying, not from violence, but from time and consequence. A new era beckoned. If it was guided by someone they trusted, a man who had proven himself again and again, a man who was a half-brother to them all, then perhaps it could thrive. The night wore on. Quiet talk gave way to the occasional jest. Someone passed around a skin of sour goat's milk that made Jon grimace. Another produced a half-jug of ale that had been traded from a northern village. Jon listened more than he spoke, gleaning from the free folks' comments that they feared not only southern aggression, but the stirring of unknown powers in the far north. The others had been beaten, or so it seemed, but the scars left behind might never fully heal. By the time the fire had died to embers, Jon was determined. Their next step would be a gathering of all the scattered tribes of free folk who would come, along with any northern bannermen who might be sympathetic. Word had to be sent quietly at first. Sansa should know, but perhaps it was best if it were Jon himself who told her what he intended. If rumors reached her first, she might suspect him of betrayal. He knew his sister too well. Though she cared for him, she had become cautious and wise in her own way. She would demand honest answers. And if he failed to persuade her, it would sour relations from the start. Dawn arrived with a weak wash of pale light that crept over the horizon, illuminating the frosted plains and stony hills. Jon rose from his furs, yawning as the cold bit the tip of his nose. Around him, the free folk began their daily tasks, gathering what scant firewood they could, checking traps for rabbits or foxes, hunting in small groups, mending tents and garments. Survival here was still an unrelenting struggle, but with each day that passed without an external threat, they grew in number and confidence. Something about this harsh life made them strong in ways the Southerners could never comprehend. John sought out Tormund near the outskirts of the camp, where the broad man and a handful of others prepared to scout the territory for game. Ghost trailed John, silent and watchful as ever. Tormund spared John a glance. "You look like a man who didn't get much sleep. Did you spend the night trying to figure out words that might convince your sister?" "Benin." John's lips curved in a wry smile. "I'd almost prefer another war than trying to convince Sansa. She'll be practical, but I think she'll see reason, as long as it doesn't threaten the North. She knows me well enough to realize I'm not trying to topple her throne." Tormund adjusted the thick belt of knives around his waist and hefted a spear. You best get a move on then. The longer you wait, the more rumors might reach her ears. You want her on your side, you'd best appear at Winterfell yourself, or at least send a raven announcing your coming." "Nezero." John nodded. "I'll do just that. But first, there's someone else I need to speak to. A man who holds some sway over the rest of the free folk. He's further north, by the great frozen lake." Tormund grunted. "You mean Hengir, that old huntsman who claims to have once shot an arrow into a giant's eye?" "That's the one. If he endorses our cause, many more will. I'll set out this afternoon. Veterana Shoaniro. Take a good horse, and watch the ice near the lake." Tormund clapped him on the back with a laugh. "If you fall in, I'm not diving after you." John managed a faint smile. Then his expression grew serious once more. "I'll leave you in charge here. Let them know a council is coming, but don't commit to when and where until I return. I need to speak to Sansa personally before we make any official announcements." Tormund's gruff face split into a grin. "I've always wanted to say I was in charge." "Sure, Jon Snow, I'll keep your seat warm. Don't take too long or I might just declare myself king of the giants in your absence." "Damnanim." John let out a small chuckle. "I'd not stand in your way." They parted ways, Tormund and his band heading off into the cold morning, their laughter echoing against the snow-laden hills. John watched them go, then gathered what supplies he needed for a journey of several days. A brown mare, sturdy but not swift, awaited him. He patted her flank, murmuring gentle assurances. Ghost looked up at him, head tilted as if to say, "Are we going?" John ran a hand through the direwolf's thick fur. "Come on then, Ghost. Let's see if we can freeze our bones for a bit." They set off north, away from the ragged clusters of tents. The day remained overcast, the sky pressing low and heavy. At times, the land spread out in monotonous white, broken only by jagged stones protruding from the ground, or the bare skeletons of stunted trees. The horses' hooves crunched in the snow, sending little sprays at each step. John thought back to simpler times, or what he had believed were simpler times, standing upon the wall with his brothers. He couldn't help but recall the day he'd first encountered Ygritte, the day the free folk had become far more than just an enemy to him. He had learned about their hearts, their families, their pride, and it had changed him forever. He pressed on, occasionally stopping to let the mare rest. Ghost padded alongside them, sometimes bounding ahead to sniff at a drift or chase a faint scent. John ate cold rations whenever hunger gnawed, drank from a water skin that started to freeze if he didn't keep it close to his body. By dusk, he spotted the distant shimmer of the great frozen lake. It was a vast stretch of ice, ringed by low hills and scattered pines, that somehow clung to life despite the punishing climate. The wind blew sharp here, hissing over the open surface. He recalled tales of how, in winter, the lake froze so thick even mammoths could cross it, though in warmer seasons it became partially navigable by small boats. That was what had drawn certain free folk tribes to settle near its banks, using the fish in the water and the migrating herds in the surrounding foothills to survive. Hengir was said to live there, a man well into his 60s by now, but still strong of voice and mind. John hoped those qualities remained intact. He found a makeshift settlement on the lake's western shore. Low huts built from stones and ice blocks, half buried against the wind. Drifts of snow formed little ramparts around them. Smoke rose from a series of holes in the roofs. When John drew near, a pair of children spotted him first, their eyes going wide at the sight of a mounted stranger with a towering white dire wolf. They vanished into one of the huts, presumably to warn the others. John dismounted slowly, pulling his cloak tighter. Ghost trotted ahead, sniffing warily. Then a group of men and women emerged, cautious but not immediately hostile. They clutched spears and axes, old scars crisscrossing their weathered faces. One man with a thick matted beard stepped forward, glancing from John to Ghost, then back again. "You come from the south side of the old wall, or from Tormund's camp?" he asked. His accent was heavy, his tone guarded. "I'm with Tormund and the others," John replied calmly. "I'm looking for Hengir. I have matters of importance to discuss with him." The man stared at him for a moment, suspicion evident. Then he recognized something in Jolin's face. "Ah, you're the crow who doesn't crow anymore. Jon Snow. He's expecting you?" That surprised John, though he hid it. "He knows I'm coming?" Then offered a grin that showed a missing front tooth. "No, but Hengir is rarely surprised by anything. Follow me." The group parted, letting John pass with the horse in tow. A few cast uneasy glances at Ghost, who maintained a regal stillness, tail swishing once or twice. Snow blew around their feet, the wind funneled by the hut so it cut in every direction. John noticed how meager the settlement was, as if they had just enough to stave off starvation through the winter. Still, there was a sense of community. Children peeked out from behind curtains of old hides. Women prepared salted fish over a smoking fire pit. Men wrapped fresh kills in cloth to keep them from spoiling. They led John to a hut in the center of the encampment, slightly bigger, with a worn leather flap for a door. The man raised his spear, tapped lightly on the frame and said, "The crow's come. He wants to speak with you." He gestured for John to duck inside. John nodded in thanks, tethered his horse, and motioned for Ghost to wait outside. The dire wolf lay down, eyes alert. John lifted the flap, stepping into the dim, smoky interior. A single lamp burned, casting flickering shadows across the rounded walls. Pelts lined the floor. The scent of pine resin from the lamp mingled with an underlying mustiness. At the far end of the hut sat Hengir. He was not as physically imposing as Tormund, nor as large as some other free folk men, but he carried an aura of quiet authority. He wore layers of fur, and his hair was iron gray, braided at the temples. His face was lined with the marks of decades in the cold and sun. A single scar trailed from the left side of his forehead, disappearing beneath the hairline. His eyes were pale blue and piercing. He beckoned John closer with a gnarled hand. "So, you've come at last," Hengir said softly, his voice like gravel rolling over ice. "I've heard tales of Jon Snow, the man who let the free folk through the wall, the man who died and came back, the man who killed the Dragon Queen, or so they say. Men love to spin stories. I suppose you want me to help spin a new one?" "Nosh." John crouched near the lamp, close enough to feel its weak heat. "I'm here because I respect what you've done for your people. And I want your counsel. Perhaps your blessing." Hengir's lips tugged in a faint smirk. "You speak plainly. I like that. Tell me what it is you want, without circling around. My bones are old, and I'd rather not waste time." John took a breath and launched into his explanation, much as he had with Tormund and the others. He spoke of the hope for a new realm, separate from the squabbles of the South, a place to protect those who had been cast aside or labeled as threats. He described how he intended to approach Sansa, how he believed there was a chance for cooperation instead of conflict. He painted a vision of forging alliances, building a fledgling kingdom of ice and fire, governed by new laws, that respected freedom while maintaining enough structure to keep their enemies at bay. Through it all, Hengir listened, his expression inscrutable. When John finished, the older man leaned back and folded his arms. "A bold ambition. Some might call it folly. Then again, you've lived a life of bold moves. Tell me why I should believe this kingdom will be different from all the others that have come and gone. Why should I risk the lives of my tribe on this dream?" "Dani." John locked eyes with Hengir, voice low. Because I know the cost of failure. I've seen the White Walkers, fought them, lost friends to them. I've seen the treachery of southern courts and the cruelty of kings and queens who cared nothing for the people they ruled. I don't want to recreate that. I want to ensure that if any darkness ever rises again, we'll stand together, free folk, Northmen, anyone willing. And if it doesn't, then we'll have a life where our children aren't used as pawns or forced into a cycle of violence. I'm not asking you to follow me blindly. I'm asking you to look at what we have, to see what we stand to lose if we remain divided. Nagnapi. Hengir's gaze slid past John to the lamp's flickering flame. Some might say the free folk aren't meant for kings or queens. We're called free for a reason. Mance Rayder tried uniting us once, and we were nearly destroyed for it. Mance Rayder wanted to break the wall to save his people from the White Walkers, John said, carefully choosing his words. He believed uniting everyone was the only way. He wasn't wrong about that. But the rest of it? We were fighting against time, and we had enemies on both sides. This time, we have a chance to build something from the ground up. Betindin. There was a lengthy silence, broken only by the soft pop of the lamp's flame. Then Hengir stood, his joints popping. He placed a thin piece of wood in the lamp to keep it alive, and gestured for John to follow him back outside. The wind tore at them immediately, whipping Hengir's braided hair across his weathered face. The old man drew himself up, looking at the settlement around them, then out toward the frozen lake that stretched to the horizon. The entire world seemed painted in stark whites and grays, save for the faint pink glow staining the sky as the sun began to set. "Look at that ice," Hengir said in a contemplative tone. "It can appear safe, but step on a patch too thin and you'll fall through, vanish into the cold waters. That's how I see your plan. If we're not careful, if we gather on the wrong patch, it might all give way. But if we pick our spot wisely, if the ice is thick enough, we could cross to a new beginning." Ninasesto. John followed Hengir's gaze, the chill biting into his cheeks. "That's why I need you, to help me pick our spot." A shadow of a smile moved across Hengir's face, quickly gone. "I'll come to your gathering, Jon Snow. I'll speak for my tribe. Others will heed me if I say there is merit in your words. But promise me one thing. If ever you begin to resemble a tyrant or a liar, if ever this new kingdom of yours strays from what you claim, you'll not begrudge us for turning our backs and walking away." "Yeah." John nodded solemnly. "I promise. If I break my word, I deserve to be cast out." Hengir looked at him a moment longer, seeming to test the sincerity in his eyes. Then he reached out and gripped John's forearm. John returned the gesture. A silent pact formed between them, uncertain but necessary. When Hengir let go, he offered a short laugh. "I suppose you'll be off to Winterfell soon. Watch yourself, Crow. The South has a way of swallowing men whole, even if you only dip a foot in it." Demturn? Pelbin. John couldn't deny the twist of anxiety in his stomach at the thought of returning to Winterfell. "Thank you, Hengir. I'll send word when I know the time and place of the council. Gather those who will come." He made his farewells to the man who'd led him inside, and to a few curious onlookers who hovered around, trying to catch snippets of conversation. Then he mounted his mare again, calling Ghost to his side. As he left the settlement behind, he glanced over his shoulder at the huts of stone and ice, the small fires struggling against the biting wind, and the figures who retreated into the safety of their makeshift homes. This was exactly why he needed to act. These people deserved more than an endless existence on the fringes of the world, living in fear of what might lurk beyond the horizon. The sun sank in the western sky, painting the underside of the clouds in streaks of lavender and copper, though the land remained stark and white. John guided his horse carefully, tracing the lake's edge for a time, until the path rose into foothills. Ghost bounded ahead, pausing to sniff the air before doubling back. A hush fell on the world, as though the land itself was waiting for his next move. Night settled in with a freezing darkness, forcing John to seek refuge against a rocky outcropping that afforded some shelter from the wind. He unpacked a small flint and steel, coaxing a few pieces of kindling into a modest fire. It crackled low, providing just enough warmth to keep his body from stiffening too badly. Ghost curled at his side, acting as a living heater. Jon pulled his cloak around him, leaning against the rock, eyes scanning the black silhouettes of distant peaks. In the flickering light, he let his mind drift to thoughts of Winterfell, Sansa's face, the words he might say. He wondered if he should send a raven first. A letter might prepare Sansa for his arrival. But ravens were not always reliable in the far north, and he had the sense that any letter he wrote might fail to convey the gravity of what he intended. No, it was better to speak face to face. Perhaps Brienne or other trusted advisors would be at her side. Even so, the first meeting would decide much. If Sansa felt threatened, she might refuse any alliance or even attempt to sabotage his efforts to create a kingdom above the north. Or if she saw the wisdom in it, she could be a powerful ally, an anchor that would keep the new kingdom from drifting into conflict with the rest of Westeros. Jon poked the embers gently. Sparks flew up, carried away on the wind. It struck him how precarious this all was, how easily his dreams could scatter like ash. But was that not always the case with hope? The risk was part of the undertaking. If he did nothing, he'd regret it for the rest of his days. And truly, what else was there for him? He had no desire to reclaim his Targaryen heritage, no interest in playing the Game of Thrones. This was the one calling that made sense. The one place where he might finally belong. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, more than he ever used to see at Castle Black. They stretched in ribbons across the cosmos, and he allowed himself a moment of awe. It felt like a sign that the world was wider and deeper than any single throne, any single war. They all played their parts in some grand, immeasurable design. He let that calm him, the steady heartbeat of wonder in his chest, lulling him to sleep. When morning came, a thin layer of frost coated his hair and beard. Ghost shook himself, scattering snow in a flurry. Jon stirred, stiff and cold, but determined to press on. He fed the horse a small handful of grain from his saddlebag and ate a bite of stale bread. The path south to the ruined wall was long, but he'd traveled it before. With luck, and barring any storms, he could make it to Castle Black in a few days, then on to Winterfell not long after. He set off, the sun a pale coin overhead. The day was quiet, almost unnervingly so. But he took it as a blessing. While the North had grown somewhat safer after the war with the dead, there were still scattered dangers, rogue bandits, restless spirits in the haunted woods, or the threat of dire weather changes. For now at least, the gods favored his journey with relative peace. That peace gave Jon time to reflect. He planned what he might say to the few knights, watch brothers still stationed at Castle Black. They might wonder at his intentions, but Jon hoped they would grant him passage without incident. Technically, he was still bound by his vow, though the realm seemed content to forget that so long as he remained away from the south. Then again, the realm had a habit of forgetting its own rules when convenient. He also mulled over how to phrase his proposition to Sansa. Then, should he couch it in terms of mutual defense, appealing to her sense of responsibility? Should he speak of forging an alliance that would be beneficial for trade between the North and this new kingdom? Or should he rely on the bond they shared, reminding her that everything he had done for family and for the good of the realm? Likely, he would need all three approaches. Sansa's mind worked in layers. She'd want to hear the practicalities as well as the sentiment. 2 days passed in similar fashion, with Jon traveling during the daylight hours and taking shelter at night. The terrain grew gradually more familiar, the rolling hills giving way to rocky expanses that signaled the ancient foothills of the Frostfangs were behind him. Occasionally he saw distant shapes or figures, but they never drew near. Sometimes he wondered if they were free folk hunters or wild animals. Ghost remained alert, sniffing at any trace, but no confrontation arose. On the third day, a swirl of fresh snow fell in the early morning, dusting the landscape anew. Jon pressed on, cloaked in a layer of silent white. By midday he spotted the faint silhouette of Castle Black's ruins on the horizon. The wall itself had been shattered in places during the war, leaving a gaping wound that once allowed the dead to flood through. Now chunks of ice and rubble remained like the bones of a long-dead beast. But the fortress known as Castle Black still stood, though at a fraction of its former strength. Smoke rose from a single chimney, and the gate was repaired with crude timbers. As John rode closer, a horn sounded once, echoing over the emptiness. Ghost's ears perked. John felt a pang of memory. How many times had he stood watch on those ramparts, waiting for anything that might threaten the realm from the north? Now it was reversed. He came from the north, bearing dreams of a new realm altogether. A single figure emerged from the gate, wrapped in black fur, a battered sword at his belt. John recognized him after a moment. Will, a ranger who had once been a new recruit under Joan's command. The man lifted a hand in greeting, though he seemed unsure. John urged his mare forward, Ghost padding beside them. As he neared, Will peered at him with a mixture of familiarity and shock. "Lord Commander," Will began, then caught himself. "I mean Jon Snow. I 8 of us remain here. Didn't think you'd ever come back." John dismounted, boots sinking into fresh snow. "I'm only passing through, Will, on my way to Winterfell. How are things here?" Will frowned slightly. "Quiet. We keep the fire going. We do patrols, but there's not much left to patrol. The free folk who wander by are usually friendly enough. They trade, we talk. Seems there's peace for now." John placed a reassuring hand on Will's shoulder. "That's good to hear. And the rest of the watch?" "There's a few more men at Eastwatch by the sea, trying to rebuild. But it's slow going. Hardly anyone new to recruit these days, and no pressing threat that the lords care about." John glanced up at the shattered wall with a twinge of nostalgia and sorrow. The world is changing. The Night's Watch has done its duty for thousands of years. Perhaps it's time for a different form of protection. Will hesitated, as though reading meaning in those words, but refrained from pressing further. "There's hot stew inside if you want some. Or a bed of straw to rest for the night. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping out in the cold." "No." John nodded, grateful. "Thank you. I'll stay the night and head south in the morning. That stew sounds good." He led his mare and Ghost through the rough-hewn gate into the courtyard. The yard was far emptier than he remembered, a lonely place. The old stables had partially collapsed, but a makeshift pen sheltered a couple of scrawny horses. The main hall looked intact enough, though the roof had been patched in spots. It was a testament to the Watch's resilience that they had salvaged what they could. John couldn't help but feel a pang for the old camaraderie that once echoed here. They tethered the horse and found some feed for it. Ghost sniffed around, then took up a position near the hall's entrance, apparently preferring the crisp air. Inside, John found the hall a shadow of its former self. A handful of men he recognized warmed themselves by a hearth. They stood when he entered, expressions ranging from curiosity to awkward respect. None seemed to know what to call him. "Lord Snow," ventured one. "Jon Snow," another corrected, offering a small bow. John greeted them each by name, calling up half-forgotten memories. They took a measure of ease from that, and soon they settled back around the hearth where a pot of stew simmered. The smell of boiled vegetables and salt pork filled the air. John accepted a bowl with thanks and sat on a bench near the crackling fire. He sipped the stew slowly, letting the warmth seep into his bones. Conversation circled around practical matters: how the hunts were faring, whether the roof might collapse if another storm blew in, the chances of receiving any supplies from the south. John listened, adding a few words here and there. He felt the men's eyes on him, each waiting for an explanation as to why he had returned. Eventually Will, who seemed the boldest among them, asked, "So, are you going to stay?" John shook his head. "No, Tom. I have business in Winterfell, but you may hear rumors soon about something stirring north of the wall. If so, don't be alarmed. I'm trying to build a new life up there." "No." The men exchanged looks. One of them, a thin steward named Randall, quietly asked, "Are you planning to? Well, do you plan to tear down what's left of the Watch?" John met his gaze. "No. The Watch has its own traditions, its own value. But times are changing. I can't say what your vows will mean to future generations, but for now, Keep doing what you must. Protect those who need it. If there comes a day when you or your brothers want to come north and see what we're building, I'll welcome you, as long as you come in peace. Then, a small flicker of relief passed over Randall's face. The others seemed uncertain but nodded slowly. They spoke little more of politics, choosing instead to focus on small talk of the day-to-day. John finished his stew and felt the press of weariness from his journey. Though he had so far to go still, a night here would provide the rest he needed before the final push to Winterfell. He curled up in a corner of the hall that had been sectioned off for sleeping, draping his cloak over himself and propping his head on a folded blanket. The sounds of the men finishing their meal and tidying up lulled him. He drifted into sleep with the memory of the stew's warmth on his tongue, and the knowledge that his next step would be the most perilous yet. Morning came, with a cold clarity. John woke, quickly gathered his things, and thanked the brothers for their hospitality. He left them with a reminder that he traveled south, not to cause trouble, but to speak with the Queen in the north. Then he took his horse from the stable pen, called Ghost to his side, and rode out of Castle Black for what might be the last time. The structure's silhouette receded behind him, merging with the broken line of ice and rubble on the horizon. The journey south felt surreal. Once, as a younger man, he had dreamed of escaping Winterfell, believing no place truly welcomed him as a bastard. Later, the Wall became his home and his duty. Then events led him beyond the Wall, shaped his destiny with the Free Folk, and now he was returning to Winterfell with a claim even more audacious than seeking acceptance for who he was. He sought acceptance for an entire kingdom of new hearts and old ways. On the second day of the southward ride, the weather grew rougher. Clouds gathered thick and dark, promising a storm. John pressed on, face numb from the wind. Ghost walked steadily alongside the horse, his fur accumulating a layer of frost that made him appear more specter than creature. Then, as dusk settled, the wind whipped into a frenzy of snow, creating a near whiteout. John cursed under his breath, guiding his horse to what appeared to be a small copse of pines. Their branches offered minimal shelter, but it was better than nothing. Ghost squeezed in under the boughs, panting lightly. John dismounted, securing the horse and patting her trembling flank. He found a leeward spot between two old tree trunks, though the wind still whistled with biting force. He managed to scrape together enough twigs and branches to start a small fire. The sparks sputtered in the wind, but eventually the tinder caught, giving him a faint, flickering glow in the swirling snow. He huddled close, mindful that the night might prove deadly if the storm worsened. The winter wind howled, carrying flurries sideways. John recalled many a storm at Castle Black, but they never seemed to get easier. They always tested a man's resolve, stripping away comfort and illusions. He whispered a soft entreaty to the old gods for safe passage, though he couldn't help but feel some measure of irony at calling on them after all that had transpired. Still, if they were listening, perhaps they would grant him the chance to see this plan through. The storm battered the pines for hours, rattling branches and dumping fresh snow. John fed the fire as best he could, but soon he had little fuel left. Eventually, the wind began to subside. He dozed intermittently, waking each time an extra vicious gust came, or when the horse shifted in panic. When dawn broke, the land was blanketed in a knee-high drift. The calm after the storm gave the world a hush, as though everything had been reset. John shook off the accumulated snow, stiff-limbed and cold to the marrow. He checked on the horse. She was shivering but still alive. Ghost looked thoroughly unamused, shaking his fur free of white clumps. With no choice but to forge ahead, John cleared a path and set out. The going was slow. Eventually, as the day wore on, the drifts grew more manageable, and the snow's glare softened under a canopy of clouds. By late afternoon, the first markers of the North's inhabited lands came into view. Scattered farmhouses, silent in the snow, smoke rising from chimneys. John felt his heart clench at the familiarity of it all. He was coming home, in a sense, but with a mission that might strain the bonds of home. He hoped Sansa would see reason, that the kingdom he proposed would not be a threat to her own power or her own people, but a partner to the North. Yet he could not deny the possibility that she would bristle at the idea, seeing it as another fracturing of the realm she strove so hard to keep whole. He crested a small hill, and there, in the distance, stood Winterfell's sturdy walls, rising against the snowy sky. Smoke curled from the great chimneys, and the banners of the direwolf sigil flapped in the breeze. Jon felt a rush of emotion, nostalgia, regret, longing. This was the place where he had grown up as a boy, who believed he had no claim, no name beyond snow. The place where he learned about honor and family, where he saw the man he called father depart, and never return. So much had changed since then. Now, he came not as a bastard, not as a supplicant, but as a man with a vision that might shake the North to its core. He gently pressed his horse forward, Ghost pacing silently beside him. The winter sky loomed overhead, a gray vault that seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for what would happen next. And Jon Snow, battered by wind and fate, rode on, determined to do what he must to ensure that the new kingdom of ice and fire he dared to imagine would have its chance to stand in the sun. Jon dismounted just beyond Winterfell's outer walls, taking a moment to steady himself while the cold wind whipped at his cloak. The sight of the castle, its gray stone, familiar towers, the watchful shape of the ramparts, brought a wave of memories that pressed against his chest like an iron weight. Ghost stood beside him, head raised, ears pricked forward. At a glance from Jon, the direwolf remained still, as though sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Snow crunched underfoot as Jon led his mare toward the gate. 2 guards stood at attention, wearing cloaks of rough-spun wool dyed in shades of brown and gray. The stark sigil, a direwolf in motion, was emblazoned on their tabards. Both men squinted at Jon, uncertain. They recognized him. Some combination of word passed over the years or old stories, but not one of them lowered his spear until Jon lifted a hand in quiet greeting. "Jon Snow," one guard said, voice echoing off the walls. He looked older than Jon remembered, with lines around his eyes that told of too many harsh winters. We weren't told you'd be coming." Jon nodded. "I wasn't sure I'd make it, but here I am. I'd like to see Queen Sansa, she's available." The guard exchanged a wary glance with his comrade, who shifted uneasily. "Her Grace hasn't said anything about guests, but I'll send word." Ghost let out a low chuff, which made both guards bristle. They eyed the direwolf with caution, though neither made a move against him. Jon gave Ghost the briefest of signals, and the creature sat back on his haunches, settling into a stance that was less threatening. "I'll wait," Jon said, his breath misting in the cold. He stood there, feeling the swirl of emotions deepen, as though each flake of snow carried an echo of what he had once been. Bastard. Brother of the Night's Watch. King in the North for a time, then no one at all. Now he came with an idea so bold it might strain the fragile peace. The older guard motioned for the younger one to go inside, and the boy, he looked like he was barely out of childhood, nodded. He dashed through the gate, boots slipping on the frosty ground. Jon stood in silence, ignoring the bitter cold that gnawed at his toes. The older guard studied Jon's face, said nothing, then finally broke his silence. "You'll find the North changed, I suppose." Jon exhaled, a puff of vapor passing his lips. "Everything changes in time." The man gave a short nod, fingers tightening on his spear. "It's good to see you, all the same. So many stories told after the war about what you did for the realm. About how you went north, never to return, but, well, here you are." Jon managed a small smile. "Yes, here I am." Before more could be said, the younger guard reappeared, breathing hard. "Her Grace says to let him in. He can go straight to the Great Hall." Jon thanked them both, and led his horse through the wide gate. The courtyard spread out, flanked by stables, the barracks, and scattered outbuildings. The stablemaster hurried over, a stocky figure in a heavy cloak, eyebrows knitted against the cold. He reached for the mare's reins, but paused when he saw the direwolf. Jon eased the tension by telling Ghost to stay close. The stablemaster, after a moment's hesitation, took the horse with a wary bow of his head. The halls of Winterfell felt both recognizable and disorienting. It had been so long since Jon had walked these corridors. The air smelled of stone, old wood, and the faint tang of cooking bread. At the far end of the courtyard rose the familiar squat tower that housed the great hall. Snow covered the rooftops in thick sheets, and the wind whistled through narrow arches. John placed a steadying hand on Ghost's fur as they made their way inside. A pair of guards flanked the doors to the great hall. They pushed them open, revealing a room lit by rows of tall, flickering torches. The warmth hit John's face first, followed by the glow of firelight that revealed a scattering of people at the tables. Many turned their heads, startled at the sudden intrusion. Some recognized him, some didn't. Whispers rippled through the hall, eyes darting between John's face and the direwolf at his side. In that moment, John felt a pang of unease, the weight of countless gazes pressing upon him. Then the dais at the far end of the hall drew his attention. Sansa sat there, wearing a dark green gown trimmed with fur, a silver direwolf pin gleaming on her shoulder. Her hair, red as sunset, was braided in a formal style that made her appear, every inch, the ruler she was. She stood as she saw John, her hands briefly gripping the arms of the chair in what looked like surprise. Slowly, she moved around the table toward him. He walked forward, trying to gauge the expression on her face, part astonishment, part guarded curiosity. When they met in the open space between tables, Sansa tilted her head up to look at him. She was composed, but her eyes held a flicker of warmth he recognized from childhood. He went to one knee, out of a sense of respect, uncertain how to greet her now. She immediately reached for him, guiding him up. "John?" she said, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "No kneeling. Not you." He rose, nodded. "Sansa." They stood there a moment, a hush falling over the hall. Ghost shifted, glancing around. Then Sansa turned to the assembled people. Courtiers, guards, a few minor lords who had been dining, and waved a hand. "Leave us. Keep a few guards at the doors, but give us the hall." Her voice carried the calm authority of a ruler well used to command. They obeyed, some with curious glances over their shoulders. Soon, only the guards by the entrance, Sansa, Jon, and Ghost, remained in that wide chamber. The tall torches crackled, casting long shadows across the flagstones. Sansa stepped back, gesturing for Jon to walk with her. They moved along the edge of the hall, where a great tapestry of the Stark sigil hung over thick stone. "You've come far," she said, her words measured, "all the way from beyond the wall." Jon nodded, noting the slight tension in her posture. "I have, and I'm sorry I didn't send word earlier. There wasn't time, and I needed to speak to you face to face." Sansa turned to study him carefully. "You look tired, colder somehow, but alive. And you brought Ghost toward you." Jon managed a small genuine smile for the first time that day. "He's never left my side since I returned north. He's been my companion through everything." Sansa looked at the direwolf, softening just a fraction. "I always did love the sight of him. Has he grown bigger?" "Somewhat," Jon said, glancing down at Ghost, who blinked at Sansa. "He's calmer now, but just as watchful." She brushed a stray hair away from her cheek. "I'm glad you're here. Bran and Arya are gone, traveling or otherwise occupied, and you know how lonely it can feel sometimes, even surrounded by people who swear their loyalty. But you didn't come only to visit. You're carrying a burden, I can see it." Jon felt the gravity of what he was about to propose settle more heavily on his shoulders. "I do have matters to discuss. May we speak in private? I'd rather not have wandering ears." Sansa nodded, leading him through a side door that opened onto a corridor. The torches in their sconces lit the way with a faint orange glow as they passed a few startled attendants who ducked out of the path. Ghost followed silently behind, fur brushing the stone walls. They passed through another archway and down a flight of stairs into a smaller chamber that functioned as a private solar, where a fireplace crackled. A heavy wooden table occupied the center, and a few chairs stood around it. Sansa closed the door behind them, leaving only a single guard outside. She gestured for Jon to sit, and when he did, Ghost settled at his feet. Sansa took the seat across from him, expression serious. A soft light from the fireplace danced across her features, revealing lines of worry that had not been there when they were children. Tell me, she said quietly. You came with purpose. You wouldn't risk travel all this way for nothing. Jon steadied himself. I'll speak plainly. The free folk and I have been living peaceably north of the wall, though we've been told my exile was supposed to keep me there indefinitely. But something's changed. The free folk are growing in number. Their old ways are returning, but there's a cautious fear that the southern lords, or even some of the northern bannermen, might see them as threats again. We all fought together in the Great War, but time makes people forget alliances forged in desperation. I don't want to see a return to skirmishes and raids or worse. No, Sansa folded her hands in her lap, studying him intently. I see. Go on. Jon paused, finding it somehow difficult to meet her gaze. He inhaled the warmth of the fire, letting it bolster his resolve. I proposed a new kingdom, one that lies beyond your domain, above the traditional bounds of the North, but still allied in peace. A kingdom of ice and fire, if you will, ruled not by the Iron Throne, or even by Winterfell, but by its own laws, shaped by the free folk and anyone else who wishes to join. A place where the old grudges can be set aside, and we can watch each other's backs if any threat arises. I want your support, or at least your blessing to form this new realm without hostility. Sansa's lips parted in surprise. She considered his words, a glimmer of astonishment passing through her eyes. Then she tilted her head. A separate realm, beyond the wall, yet close enough to still influence the North. That's a bold dream. Have you thought about how the lords here might see it? They'll suspect a break, a challenge to my rule. Or they might fear the free folk will gather strength and eventually spill south. Then? Jon shook his head. They won't. Not under me. But I understand their fears. That's why I need your help. You can speak for me. You can remind them that we faced the dead together, that our best chance for continued peace lies in cooperation. If we push the free folk away or threaten them, they'll have to take steps to defend themselves. We'd both lose. Sansa's posture remained poised, though her eyes flickered with conflicting emotions. She turned her gaze to the flames for a moment, the light dancing on her features. And you would be, what, exactly, king of this new kingdom? Is that what you wish to call yourself now? Jon felt warmth rising in his cheeks, not just from the fire. I don't care about the title. If calling me king is what it takes for the free folk and others to unite, so be it. I'd do it to keep the peace. But there's no throne of stone or iron, no crown of gold. It'd be something simpler, with laws that we create together. It's not about power, Sansa. It's about ensuring we don't repeat the cycle of war. And she. Sansa regarded him for a long moment, her eyes drifting between his own and the direwolf at his feet. You sound so earnest, as always, and you've always cared more for duty than ambition. Yet you also carry the weight of who you are, who you might be if anyone ever chose to test your Targaryen blood. In the South, your name still turns heads, even if you want no part of that legacy. Jon frowned, a flicker of old pain catching in his chest. I want nothing to do with that. The Targaryens are gone as far as I'm concerned. My name is Snow, or Stark, or both. That matters little now. I was never meant for the Iron Throne. But I can't ignore what's happening in the North. I can't just let these people fend for themselves, while the rest of the realm forgets them again. Sansa folded her hands more tightly. And you expect me to publicly endorse you as ruler of a separate kingdom? The lords could interpret that as me giving away part of the North to you. They'll bristle if they think I'm losing territory or subjecting them to new uncertainties. They already worry that a queen who was once a Lannister prisoner, once a Bolton captive, might not be strong enough to protect them from the next threat. They see me handing power to you, they might suspect I've abandoned the North's sovereignty. Or they'll fear you'll overshadow me. No, Nin. Jon leaned forward, voice quiet. That's the last thing I want. I only seek your acceptance, your recognition that we won't be your enemies if you leave us in peace. We'll stand by you should the time ever come when you need it. I know you must worry about your own legitimacy in the eyes of your lords. But this is a chance to demonstrate your wisdom. Show them that you can preserve the North while forging alliances that don't demand further bloodshed. Isn't that what you've always wanted? A lasting peace, a realm where the horrors we faced aren't repeated. Vastemorum. Sansa let out a soft, weary breath. It is. But wanting peace and forging it are two different things. Still, you are my family. And your word has always meant more to me than any vow from a stranger. You're also right that conflict with the free folk won't help anyone. We worked too hard to stop the long night, only to let it all unravel. Lenemanatoro. Jon felt a flicker of hope. Then you'll consider it. She rose from her seat, walking to the fireplace. The soft light revealed the subtle tension in her shoulders. She stood there with one hand resting on the mantel, gazing into the flames as if they held answers. After a stretch of silence, she turned back to him, her expression resolved. I won't promise you a formal endorsement this instant. I need time to gauge the sentiments of my bannermen. If half of them recoil in horror at the thought, I'll have to be strategic. And you'll need to meet them, to speak to them. If they see your sincerity firsthand, they might set aside their prejudices. But it won't be easy. Some lost loved ones to wildling raids in the past. Old wounds don't heal quickly. Nevertheless. Jon nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. I had expected it wouldn't be easy. You have my word that I'll face them openly, answer their questions, swear that our aims are peaceful. I'm prepared to stay in Winterfell as long as necessary to convince them. Marnean. Sansa considered that, her gaze flicking to Ghost again, then back to Jon. Then that's what we'll do. I'll gather the important houses. The Serwans, the Mormonts, the Glovers, any who hold sway. I'll summon them here for a council, perhaps in a week or two. They'll want to know why you've returned and what you plan. You can speak to them directly. Jon felt a cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Thank you, he said quietly. That's all I can ask. She inclined her head. You look exhausted. Let's find you a room. And a meal that isn't half frozen, I imagine. Winterfell is still your home. Whatever else happens, that won't change. The warmth in her tone touched him more than he cared to admit. He rose, Ghost standing as well, ears pricked. Sansa pressed a hand to Jon's arm, in a gesture that reminded him of simpler days. Then she led him out of the solar and into the corridors once more, calling to a passing attendant, instructing them to prepare a chamber for Jon near the old wing of the castle. As they made their way through the twisting halls, they passed several guards and servants, each doing a double-take at the sight of Jon Snow returned. Some of the older ones recognized him from his youth. He could see the flicker of memory in their eyes. Others only knew him by reputation, and their expressions were guarded, uncertain. Still, none interfered. Once they reached the chamber, Sansa motioned him inside. It was a modest room, not grand but comfortable, with a small hearth, a bed draped in furs, and a narrow window slit that overlooked one of the courtyards. The fireplace had not yet been lit, so a chill clung to the walls, but an attendant quickly set about kindling a fire, while another scurried off to fetch warm water for a basin. Sansa lingered a moment in the doorway. I'll have food brought up shortly, and after you've rested we can speak more. Perhaps in the morning we'll discuss how best to approach the bannermen. The last thing I want is to see tensions flare into violence. Jon nodded, setting down his pack. Thank you, Sansa, for giving me a chance. Her gaze flickered with what might have been affection. We're family, Jon. I may be a queen, but some bonds run deeper than titles. Rest now. New tea. With that, she departed, leaving him alone with Ghost and the crackling, newly lit flames. Jon stood there, letting the heat wash over him, feeling the ache in his muscles from days of travel. He sat on the edge of the bed, carefully removing his gloves, flexing stiff fingers. His mind buzzed with the knowledge that he was one step closer to making his dream real, but also with the certainty that 1,000 obstacles remained. Ghost padded over to the hearth, turning in a circle before lying down, eyes half-lidded. The direwolf's presence was a comfort, a reminder that Jon was not alone. He let himself rest for a few minutes, forcing the tension out of his shoulders, breathing in time with the gentle crackle of the flames. The castle was quiet, though faint footsteps in the corridor reminded him it was alive with people who might soon judge his intentions. He drifted into a light doze, only to be awakened by a knock at the door. A servant entered with a tray of food, warm bread, stew, and a mug of mulled wine that steamed invitingly. She set it on a small table and departed, eyes lowered in deference. John thanked her, rose, and made his way to the table. The stew smelled far more enticing than any rations he'd eaten on the road, and the bread's crust crackled pleasantly when he tore into it. He ate slowly, letting each bite ground him in the reality of Winterfell, of a hearth and four walls that kept out the fierce wind. As he sipped the mulled wine, a sense of calm settled over him. Tomorrow would bring the first steps toward this delicate alliance. Sansa would spread word that he was here, and rumors would swirl among the household staff and any local representatives of the northern lords. Whispers traveled fast in a castle. By the time a formal council was called, half the north would be buzzing with speculation about the reason for Jon Snow's return. Setting his empty bowl aside, Jon removed his boots and cloak, placing them near the fireplace to dry. He washed briefly using the basin of warm water, scrubbing off the grit of travel. Then he lay back on the bed, pulling furs over his legs, and closed his eyes. Ghost snored softly by the fire, a muffled rumble that blended with the low hum of the flames. He dreamed of wide expanses of snow, of monstrous ice fissures he had to cross. Tormund appeared at one point, laughing as he balanced on a narrow ledge of ice while beckoning Jon forward. On the other side stood Sansa, wearing a crown of pine needles and frost, gesturing for him to step carefully or risk plunging into blackness below. Ghost prowled in the background, silent as a wraith. Even in the dream, Jon felt the tension of being suspended between two worlds, not fully belonging to either, yet trying desperately to unite them. Then he fell, tumbling into a void of cold wind that tore at his clothes. He awoke with a start, to find the room's fire low, the embers casting a dull glow. Night had settled deeply. The wind outside the window slit sounded like a distant lament. Jon's heart thudded as he reassured himself that it had only been a dream. He sat up, shivering a little in the darkness, and reached for a nearby candle. The flame flickered to life, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Ghost stirred, lifting his head. Jon murmured, "It's all right," though he couldn't be certain if he was speaking to the direwolf or to himself. Slipping out of bed, he added a few more pieces of wood to the hearth, coaxing the fire to return. Outside, the silence of Winterfell at night was enveloping, broken only by the occasional footstep of a guard on patrol, or a gust of wind knocking loose some snow from a roof. Jon sat by the fire for a time, letting the dancing warmth settle him. Eventually he dozed off again, head bowed, arms resting on his knees. When morning came, he woke stiff and sore, but the fear of the dream had faded. He found that fresh clothing had been left for him on a small chest. Simple breeches and a tunic of dark gray wool, lined with fur. It felt odd to wear clothes that weren't patched together from the free folk, or the Night's Watch surplus had used in recent years. After dressing, he slipped on his boots and ventured into the corridor. Ghost padded alongside him, tail swishing. He made his way toward the great hall, noting how the castle's passages were already busy with servants carrying trays, coals, linens. Some paused to bow or curtsy, though the curiosity in their eyes was clear. Jon nodded courteously, continuing on until the faint smell of fresh bread guided him to the large dining area. He found a table where a few men-at-arms and officials of the household were breaking their fast. They quieted upon seeing him, making space. He accepted a seat, though he sensed their trepidation. A servant offered him a plate of porridge, bread, and a wedge of cheese. He thanked her, mindful of the hush that followed him like a shadow. Partway through the meal, Sansa appeared in the doorway. She wore a heavy gown of deep brown, belted at the waist, with a cloak draped over her shoulders. Her hair was arranged in a more practical style than the day before, perhaps because she expected to be at council meetings or dealing with matters of state. She offered a polite greeting to the household before moving to Jon's side. He stood to greet her, and she gestured for him to continue eating. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice low. "I've asked a few of my advisors to join us in a smaller council chamber. If you've eaten enough, we can head there now." Jon pushed the half-finished plate aside, not wanting to keep her waiting. "Lead the way." She inclined her head, glancing at the men seated nearby with a thoughtful expression, then turned and made her way out. Jon followed, Ghost at his heels. They ascended a set of stone steps that led to a corridor lined with tapestries showing the Stark lineage, scenes of direwolves amid forests of snow. At the end of the corridor was a solid wooden door with iron bands. 2 guards in Stark livery stood at attention. Sansa nodded to them, and they pushed the door open. Inside, a circular chamber awaited, warmed by a central hearth. A round table occupied the middle of the room, with several chairs arranged around it. 3 people were already there: a thin man with silver-streaked hair and a precise manner of dress, a burly bearded figure in heavy furs, and a woman with short-cropped hair and the stern expression of someone well accustomed to command. They rose when Sansa entered. "Lord Bolton," Sansa said in greeting to the bearded man. "Maester Tybalt," she added to the thin fellow, "and Lady Cerwyn." She then introduced them to Jon. "My brother, Jon Snow." Jon inclined his head, observing their expressions carefully. The mention of brother rather than cousin or exiled half-brother was not lost on him. Sansa was presenting a united front. He took that as a promising sign. Lord Bolton, no relation to the infamous Boltons of old, Jon recalled, but a distant branch that had adopted the name after the main line was eradicated, stared at Jon with undisguised curiosity. "We've heard rumors, my lord. They said you were living among the wildlings in the far north, and now you return. May I ask your purpose?" Before Jon could answer, Sansa gestured for them all to be seated around the table. Ghost settled behind Jon's chair, drawing the occasional wary glance. Maester Tybalt, an older man with a neat gray beard, pulled a scrap of parchment from his sleeve, preparing to take notes if necessary. Lady Cerwyn rested her elbows on the table, frowning slightly. Sansa began. "Jon has come with an important proposal for the realm. I asked the 3 of you here because you've served as close advisors in matters of policy, negotiations, and northern concerns. I trust you to keep this discussion private until I determine the best way to present it to the rest of the bannermen." Jon cleared his throat, feeling the heft of their scrutiny. "I will speak plainly, as I did with Queen Sansa. I've seen the free folk grow in number again. Tormund Giantsbane, Hengir the Huntsman, and others are leading their tribes. They're prepared to live peacefully north of what remains of the wall, so long as they're not threatened. But old grievances remain on both sides. The fear among the free folk is that, given time, the South will forget our alliance against the dead and treat them as outlaws again. I aim to prevent that. I propose forming a separate kingdom beyond the wall. A kingdom that stands independent of the Iron Throne and the North, but allied in spirit." Maester Tybalt set his quill aside, brow furrowed. "A separate kingdom. That suggests some sort of structured rule, laws, perhaps treaties with the North. Yet the free folk have always resisted such formal arrangements. They're notoriously independent." "Beckerbend." "They are," Jon agreed. "But they're also realists. They know they need stability and trade if they want to survive in this new age. If they remain disorganized, southern lords might exploit them, or smaller factions might turn to raiding just to feed themselves. None of us want that." Lord Bolton stroked his beard. "And you plan to be this kingdom's ruler? Forgive me, but it sounds almost mad. The free folk do not kneel willingly." Jon resisted the urge to bristle at the question. "It isn't about kneeling. It's about trust. They remember that I led them through the wall when the White Walkers threatened. They recall that I died once for that cause. Some consider me one of their own now, even if I'm also connected to the North. They're willing to follow me because I've earned their respect. That's not the same as kneeling." "Source." Lady Cerwyn tapped her fingers on the table, her stern gaze fixed on Jon. "How do we know you won't turn your new kingdom into a staging ground against us, if conflict arises?" The North has had its share of troubles with the wildlings in the past. Sansa spoke up before Jon could. We can address that by hammering out specific treaties, mutual defense, trade agreements, resource sharing. If this kingdom stands, they'll rely on us for certain goods, and we might rely on them for furs, game, or other resources the far north provides. It becomes a matter of mutual benefit rather than enmity. The chamber fell quiet for a moment, each advisor weighing the idea. The only sound was the crackling fire and the faint scratch of Maester Tybold's quill as he jotted down a note. Jon kept his breathing steady, recalling that this was just the first step in what might be a long series of negotiations. Maester Tybold finally spoke. "Your Grace, if we consider this proposition, we must also evaluate how the rest of the Seven Kingdoms might react. Some of the southern lords could see this as an invitation for conflict. They might not distinguish between a free folk kingdom and an open threat on their northern border. Or worse, they might think you're losing control of the land they still associate with Stark rule. How do we manage that perception?" Demetrius. Sansa leaned forward slightly. "We clarify that the North remains the North. This new territory beyond the Wall has never truly been part of any southern kingdom, despite old claims on maps. We would also point out that the free folk fought valiantly against the dead. They're not the same threat they once were. If necessary, I'll send ravens to King's Landing, though it's not as if they hold more influence over the far north now. Their focus is on rebuilding the south. I doubt they'll risk sending armies to the edge of the world." Lord Bolton let out a low rumble of a laugh. "Perhaps not, but politics can shift in an instant. We must consider the possibility. For now, I see no immediate harm in hearing more. This is certainly unusual, but so were the circumstances that led to the Great War." He looked at Jon. "I'd like to know your next steps." Jon glanced at Sansa, then at the others. "My hope is to hold a gathering here at Winterfell in the coming weeks, inviting representatives from the Free Folk, Tormund, Hengar, and others willing to attend, along with the major northern lords. We can discuss terms face to face, ensure no misunderstandings linger, and hopefully come to a mutual agreement. If we can show unity, if the North and the Free Folk can sign some form of treaty, it sets the tone for all the realms. It tells the South this arrangement is legitimate." Lady Serwyn raised an eyebrow. "It sounds like you're asking for the North to host wildling leaders inside our ancestral seat. That alone could stir rumors, but perhaps you're right. Transparency is important. Better to meet openly than skulk about in secrecy. I'll admit, my family lost members to wildling raids long ago, so I have my reservations. Yet the current times demand new approaches." Sansa offered a small smile. "We all carry scars, Lady Serwyn, but we must remember how they fought beside us when it truly mattered." A reflective hush followed. Jon observed each face, trying to read the subtle shifts of expression. Lord Bolton seemed pragmatic, not wholly opposed. Lady Serwyn was cautious but open to reason. Maester Tybold simply recorded details, his intellectual curiosity piqued. Sansa exhaled, folding her hands on the table. "We'll proceed. I'll reach out to my bannermen within the next day or two, requesting their presence at Winterfell for a council. Jon, you'll remain here. In the meantime, it might be wise to speak with some of them informally as they arrive, assuaging their fears one by one." Jon gave a short nod. "Whatever it takes." Bolton stood, grunting as he did. "Very well. I'll speak with some of the local houses on my way back to my lands. If the Queen commands me to do so, I'll encourage them to attend, though I cannot promise their support." "We'll see." Lady Serwyn rose as well, adjusting the collar of her cloak. "I'll inform my father and brothers. They'll likely come to see you speak for themselves, Jon Snow. It might help if they see you as a Stark, not just a former Crow." At that, Jon found himself glancing at Sansa Dot. She caught his eye and gave the smallest of nods, understanding. The meeting concluded soon after, with the three advisors departing the chamber, leaving Jon and Sansa alone by the crackling hearth. A sense of cautious momentum hovered in the air, as though they had taken the first step onto a frozen lake. Yet they hadn't fallen through the ice, not yet. Sansa turned to him, letting out a breath she seemed to have been holding. Well, that went better than I feared. They didn't storm out or accuse you of betrayal. John managed a wry smile. It's a start. She rubbed at her arms as if suddenly feeling the cold. We'll have to work carefully to ease tensions. Some of these houses endured raids, kidnappings. They remember the free folk as enemies. You'll need to remind them of Hardhome, the Battle of the Bastards, the Long Night, how we stood together. Personal stories might help, how Tormund saved your life or fought off whites to protect Winterfell. People respond to tales they can connect with. John recalled the countless acts of bravery he'd witnessed among the free folk. Men, women, children who risked everything to stand against the dead. Perhaps those stories would do more than a formal treaty could. I'll speak from the heart. It's all I know. Sansa studied him for a moment. You haven't changed as much as I expected, John. You still look like the man who left us to protect the realm. But there's a gravity to you now, a sort of calm. He thought of the night spent in the biting cold, the negotiations with free folk leaders, the quiet acceptance of a life lived in the margins. I've had time to think, time to let go of certain illusions. She gave a small, sad smile. I've let go of illusions too. One day, I'd like to compare notes about what we've learned. Denderin. He nodded, feeling a swell of affection for his sister. No queen, but always his sister, truly. I'd like that. They left the council chamber, stepping into the corridor. Sansa walked with him for a stretch, speaking softly of logistical matters. Which local lords might arrive first, how to house the free folk representatives once they crossed the wall. John realized they'd need safe passage. Some might insist on bringing armed escorts. He offered to personally travel north to escort Tormund and the others when the time came, ensuring no chance skirmish with the remaining Night's Watch or overzealous northerners. Sansa agreed that was prudent. By the time they reached the main hall again, the castle had fully awakened. Courtiers milled about, a few lesser lords chatted near the hearth, and servants bustled with trays of steaming dishes for the midday meal. John heard snatches of conversation, bits about shipments of grain from the Vale, the allocation of lumber for repairs to the outer walls, speculation on the Queen's next move. Whispers about Jon Snow's return seemed to permeate every corner, though no one dared approach him directly yet. Sansa departed to attend to her duties, leaving John alone by the large fireplace. He lingered, gazing into the flames, sorting through his thoughts. Eventually, a timid page approached, announcing that a room had been prepared for Ghost in the old kennels, if John wished to keep the direwolf there. John politely declined, stating that Ghost preferred to remain at his side, and that the direwolf was well trained enough not to cause trouble. The page gulped, nodded, and hurried off, seeming relieved. John sighed, realizing how imposing Ghost's presence could be to those who didn't know him. Still, the direwolf was both his protector and a symbol of his bond to the north. As the day unfolded, John roamed the courtyard to reacquaint himself with Winterfell's layout. He noted new additions, a repaired stable, a refurbished armory, expanded living quarters that Sansa must have commissioned for her growing court. The scars of past battles still marked some walls, but the castle pulsed with life, forging its own renewal. Servants salted walkways to prevent slipping on ice, guards patrolled the battlements, blacksmiths hammered iron in the forge. It was a far cry from the half-empty stronghold he remembered after the wars. Ghost padded beside him, sniffing the air, occasionally stopping to investigate a corner or an archway, as if recalling old scents from distant memory. Snow continued to fall in light drifts, swirling around them in lazy spirals. John couldn't help feeling a pang of nostalgia for his childhood here, even if so much of it had been overshadowed by his status as a bastard. It was still home in some deep sense. Late in the afternoon, John ventured to the Godswood. The ancient weirwood tree stood at the heart of Winterfell, its bark white as bone, its red leaves a silent testament to the old gods. John stood beneath its boughs, letting the hush of the enclosed grove wash over him. The faint trickle of a nearby hot spring added to the serene atmosphere. Snow coated the ground, but the thermal heat kept a thin layer of warmth seeping through. Ghost stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching. John closed his eyes, remembering the first time he had prayed here as a boy. He hadn't known if the gods listened to bastards. Now, After all he'd experienced, death, resurrection, war, he wasn't even certain if the old gods still listened to him, or if he was beyond their plans. But he offered a quiet entreaty anyway. He asked them to guide him in this precarious endeavor, to let him keep the peace he sought, for the sake of the free folk, the North, and all the living who might benefit from it. He thought of Tormund's raucous laugh, and the warmth of a free folk gathering around a communal fire. He thought of Sansa's weary resolve, and the heavy crown she wore, if not literally, then in every gesture. He thought of the many unknown children who would grow up in this new realm, whether beyond the wall or in the fields around Winterfell, children who might be spared the horrors he had seen. That was the heart of it, truly. Not power or legacy, but the chance for future generations to live free of the nightmares that had once nearly consumed them all. As he opened his eyes, the wind stirred the red leaves overhead, making them rustle softly like whispers. He took that as a sign, or at least a comforting sound. Turning back, he found Ghost watching him with those bright crimson eyes, unblinking. The two regarded each other in the stillness, and Jon felt the familiar bond that went beyond words. In that moment, he resolved that he would see this through, no matter the obstacles. A distant bell tolled, signaling the approach of evening. Jon made his way out of the Godswood, crossing a small stone bridge over the warm spring that flowed beneath. He paused for a moment at the gate, glancing back at the weirwood's carved face, those eyes like tears of blood. Then he continued on. By the time he returned to the main courtyard, Sansa Stewart was waiting with a message, a small gathering at supper in the Great Hall, where a few local knights and minor lords would be present. Sansa encouraged Jon to attend, to begin informal discussions. He felt a flutter of nerves. He had never relished the political side of leadership, finding it taxing compared to the simplicity of wielding a sword. But he knew this was part of the path he'd chosen. He washed and changed quickly, wearing a simple dark tunic over his breeches. Ghost waited outside the hall, as Sansa suggested that the direwolf's presence might be more intimidating than helpful during delicate talks. Jon agreed, though he disliked leaving Ghost behind. The direwolf curled up by a brazier in the courtyard, seemingly content to wait. Jon entered the great hall at dusk. The long tables were set with modest fare: roast venison, stewed turnips, bread, and ale. The hall was lit by overhead chandeliers, and the great fire in the center pit, casting dancing shadows across the stone floor. Sansa sat at the high table, where a handful of guests gathered. Jon recognized Lord Glover's cousin, a stout man with a ruddy face, deep in conversation with a sharp-eyed woman who wore the sigil of House Mormont on a brooch. The atmosphere seemed genial but guarded. When Jon approached, Sansa introduced him to each in turn, her words calm and assured. He greeted them politely, noting the curiosity that flared in their eyes. One or two frowned at the mention of his years beyond the wall, but none voiced outright hostility. They ate in an atmosphere of restrained courtesy, sipping ale and exchanging polite remarks. Partway through the meal, conversation turned to the topic on everyone's mind. The Mormont woman, Lady Kessa, cousin to the late Lyanna Mormont, leaned forward, her face a blend of skepticism and interest. "You're the Jon Snow who fought with the wildlings, who brokered peace with them once before." Jon swallowed a bite of bread. "Yes, I was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch when we first made those arrangements. We let them pass through the wall to escape the White Walkers." She nodded. "House Mormont remembers the undead well. Our losses were heavy, but we also recall the free folk fighting beside us. So, you intend to keep that alliance now?" "Oh, one day I." Jon set his mug down, meeting her gaze. "More than keep it. Expand it into something lasting. They've bled for the realm too. They deserve a chance to live without fear." Lord Glover's cousin, a man called Edric, narrowed his eyes. "But, do we run the risk of them becoming a threat? We all know how the free folk can be if times are lean. Raiding might start again, especially if they grow hungry." Jon's voice remained steady. "They won't raid if we establish proper trade. Hunting in the far north can provide game, furs, goods that you might find valuable. In return, they could receive grain, metals, medicines. Both sides benefit. It's better than conflict." "Beowulf." Edric rubbed his chin thoughtfully, still cautious but not entirely closed off. Sansa gave Jon a supportive look, letting him lead the conversation. The talk continued into the evening, covering topics from border patrols to the prospect of letting free folk trade in northern markets. Some points raised concerns: how to ensure no criminals slipped south, how to handle disputes over territory. Jon tried to answer honestly, emphasizing that any new kingdom would need agreed-upon boundaries and laws. Though the meal eventually ended, the questions persisted. Jon noticed that while some remained skeptical, none seemed violently opposed. The memory of the long night lingered, reminding them all that divisions nearly doomed humanity once. In that knowledge, Jon found a faint hope that fear could be overcome by reason. After the last bits of food were cleared away, and the cups refilled for a final round of wine, Sansa stood, thanking her guests for their counsel. She hinted that a formal gathering would follow soon, where the details of Jon's proposal could be presented more thoroughly. The lords and ladies rose, offering polite bows, then drifted away to their chambers, or the warmth of smaller fireside gatherings. Jon and Sansa remained by the high table as servants gathered plates. The hall emptied, leaving only a handful of guards near the doors. Sansa exhaled, her breath misting in the chilly air. "That's a decent start. You handled their questions well." Jon rested a hand on the table, leaning on it for a moment. "It wasn't as bad as I feared. They're wary, but not hostile." "Better myself?" Sansa nodded, pulling her cloak around her shoulders. "You gave them reason to think, and that's often the first step. Tomorrow, or in the days to come, they'll speak to others. The idea will spread. We just have to steer it carefully." He gave her a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you. Without you, they'd probably have me thrown back over the wall." She let out a small laugh, a sound that reminded him of simpler times. "We've come a long way from that." They lingered a moment longer, standing together in the vastness of the great hall. Then she bid him good night, and he ventured out to rejoin Ghost in the courtyard. The direwolf rose, tail wagging in the barest hint of movement, and accompanied Jon back through the corridors to his chamber. As Jon prepared for sleep, shedding his day's clothes and wrapping himself in furs, he allowed a trace of cautious optimism. The path forward was treacherous, but seeds of acceptance had been planted. He had stepped into the current of northern politics and free folk independence, and the waters were swirling around him. But at least he had not been swept away yet. He drifted to sleep with the memory of Sansa's determined face lingering behind his closed eyelids. It was the face of someone who had learned hard lessons in the courts of enemies, who had survived cruelty and manipulation. If she could find a way to trust him, to trust in this new kingdom's promise, then perhaps others would follow her lead. Perhaps the North and the free folk could truly forge something beyond their bloody history. Morning would bring fresh challenges, more discussions, and the summons to gather the Great Council. Jon told himself he was ready. Yet in the secrecy of his own heart, he felt the uncertainty that always lingered when a man tried to reshape the world. He felt the old ghosts of duty, honor, and sacrifice, each whispering that this time must be different. If he failed, everything they'd fought for could unravel. If he succeeded, a new age might dawn at last. He exhaled in the dim glow of the dying fire, listening to Ghost's steady breathing by the door. Sleep claimed him in slow waves, carrying him toward the next day's horizon with its swirling questions and glimmering hope. Above the castle, snow drifted from the sky in gentle silence, cloaking Winterfell in a white hush that foretold both challenge and possibility. And somewhere in that hush, the seeds of Jon Snow's vision, his kingdom of ice and fire, waited to be born. Ilanka. Jon awoke to a gray light, seeping through the narrow window slit of his chamber. Outside, a fresh snowfall blanketed Winterfell's roofs and walls, muffling the usual bustle of morning activity. He blinked away the last vestiges of sleep, aware of the slight ache in his back from nights spent traveling, and nights spent in uneasy dreams. Nearby, Ghost lifted his head, red eyes fixed on Jon with quiet alertness, as though waiting for a signal that the day was about to begin in earnest. He rose, pulling on the garments Sansa's attendants had laid out for him. Sturdy breeches, a woolen tunic, and thick socks for the cold floors. Each movement reminded him of the responsibilities that now weighed upon him. The new kingdom he envisioned, one that bridged the gap between free folk and Northmen, was no longer just a private dream. It had begun to take shape in hushed conversations, uncertain pledges, and the watchful eyes of lords who feared what such a change would mean. Ghost trotted to the door as John laced up his boots. The Direwolf's ears twitched at the distant clang of metal in the courtyard. Perhaps a blacksmith had already begun the day's work. John opened the door, stepping into the corridor. A pair of house guards in stark livery stood at intervals along the passage, heads turning sharply when he emerged. They bowed their heads respectfully, still uncertain if they should address him as "My Lord," or "Lord Snow," or something else entirely. He offered a short nod, allowing Ghost to precede him. The direwolf's claws clicked on stone as they made their way toward the great hall. Along the way, John passed a few minor functionaries who scurried about with parchments in hand, discussing supply inventories, or the arrival of prospective bannermen later in the week. Whispers followed John as he went, each voice hushed, as if everyone knew that a delicate alliance, one that could reshape the North, was being spun behind Winterfell's walls. At the entrance to the great hall, John caught a flicker of movement from within. He stepped through the large wooden doors, Ghost by his side. The hall was less crowded than at supper the night before, but Sansa was there, conferring with Maester Tybalt, Lady Cerwyn, and a few others. A handful of minor lords and knights from neighboring lands had arrived early, drawn by rumors that the Queen had a significant announcement. As soon as John entered, the murmurs died to a hush, and all heads turned. Sansa lifted her gaze from the parchment she was examining. Her face betrayed a brief flicker of relief at Jon's presence. "Good morning," she said, voice clear. She gestured for him to join them at the table that had been set up near the dais, an informal space for conversation. "We were just discussing the potential arrival times of various bannermen. Some could come within 3 days. Others, especially those farther west, might need a week or more." Mander Boar. John made his way over, offering a polite incline of his head to Lady Cerwyn, Maester Tybalt, and the others present. He took a chair, feeling the silent scrutiny of the gathering. Ghost settled a few feet behind him, watchful but calm. "Has anyone sent replies yet?" Sansa nodded, beckoning a servant to hand her a small sheaf of letters. She flipped through them quickly. "Yes, a few ravens returned last night. Lord Manderley says he'll come, though he can't leave White Harbor for another 4 or 5 days. He's dealing with a dispute involving a Braavosi trade ship. Lord Locke says he'll arrive sooner, within 3 days. The Umbers apparently have some matter of bandits near the Long Lake, but I expect at least one representative will appear, even if the main lord is detained. Others are slower to respond." "Then," Maester Tybalt, peering over her shoulder, added, "the Risewells, Glovers, Cerwyns, and some lesser houses are more likely to arrive promptly. The Boltons." He paused, glancing at Sansa with an awkward look. "The new Bolton line, rather, will also attend, as their lordship is still seeking the Queen's favor, given past unfortunate history." John knew that mention of Bolton would forever stir grim memories. Winterfell itself had been seized by that name in times not so distant, and Sansa had suffered deeply at their hands. Yet she wore the mask of composure. "We can't afford to snub them," she said quietly. "They've been loyal enough since the extinction of the direct Bolton line. We'll watch them carefully, but we need their support." "Let's see." John looked at her. "And what of Lady Mormont's kin, or the Karstarks?" Lady Cerwyn piped up, a faint smile tugging at her stern mouth. "House Mormont's leadership changed hands again. Lady Lyanna's death left them in disarray, but they've stabilized under her cousin Danae. She's known for her bluntness, like most of that house. If she arrives, expect hard questions. As for the Karstarks, I'm not certain. They've been quiet lately. Perhaps they'll come, or perhaps they think it's not worth the journey. Perhaps they'll come, or perhaps they think it's not worth the journey." John mulled that over. The Karstarks' loyalty had wavered in the past, though he recalled how some of them eventually followed him and Sansa in the war. "We'll see," he murmured. "Perhaps they'll want to know if this new arrangement might threaten their borders." Sansa glanced around the table, eyes sharp. "We don't have an exact count of how many might show. Still, the point is that by the time everyone arrives, we'll have quite a gathering. John, you should be prepared. Once the main council is announced, they'll all want to hear from you. They'll want specifics. Vague talk of peace won't be enough. They'll want to know how you'll ensure the free folk abide by certain laws, or how trade will be regulated, or where their new boundaries lie. Men shall. John nodded. I understand. And I also intend to send for Tormund or another free folk representative soon if possible. They need to be here to speak for themselves. Otherwise, we'll be making decisions on their behalf, which isn't what we want. I'll ride north in a few days, once we know exactly when this council will convene, so I can guide them safely south of the wall. A brief silence followed. One of the minor lords near the table, a man with thinning hair and a foxpin on his cloak, cleared his throat. Begging pardon, your grace, but is it wise to bring wildling chieftains into Winterfell? Even if we trust them, the soldiers and common folk might see it as a threat. Sansa shifted, measuring her words. We want to avoid needless friction, yes. But if this is to be a legitimate agreement, we must treat them as guests, not as enemies. That means meeting face to face, in good faith. I expect all my bannermen to show respect as long as our guests remain peaceful. Then so. John saw the man's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But Sansa's tone carried a quiet finality. After all, she was the queen in the north, and her word was law, provided she could maintain the loyalty of those who had chosen her. When the discussion wrapped up, the group dispersed, each person heading to their tasks. Sansa stepped aside to speak privately with John before she left for another round of duties. The flickering torches that lined the hall cast elongated shadows across the stones beneath their feet. I'll have additional rooms prepared, she said softly, for Tormund and any other free folk who come. It won't be lavish, but they'll have a roof and warmth. If that seems like an overreach, let me know. I don't want them to think we're patronizing them. John shook his head. No, it should be fine. Tormund might scoff at the walls, but he won't mind a warm bed. They'll appreciate the gesture, so long as we don't lock them in. She allowed a small smile. I'll see that the doors remain open. In truth, I'm curious to meet them again, under calmer circumstances. John remembered the chaotic night before the Battle of Winterfell, how the free folk had mingled awkwardly with the northerners, how Tormund had loudly praised the taste of northern ale while trying to regale a stony-faced group of knights with tales of giant's milk. Strange that they had come so far. You'll find Tormund in good spirits. The others, too, though some are more suspicious. They've lost many over the years, and they've never quite trusted the Kneelers. Nadandan. He paused, glancing toward the tall windows of the hall, which admitted only a pallid winter light. I'll have to leave soon for the north. If I ride out in 2 days, that should give me time to get Tormund and whoever else he brings back here before all the bannermen arrive. Sansa considered it. 2 days might be best. By then, I'll know exactly how many lords are planning to attend and when. Be careful. The roads aren't as well guarded in the far reaches. I can spare an escort of 12 men if you want. Alien sigh. John considered the offer. That might be wise. Not for me, but to prevent misunderstandings. If a small group from Winterfell escorts me, and we meet any northern patrols, it'll be clear we're on official business. That may head off any suspicion or hostility. She nodded. I'll have someone arrange it. You can choose men you trust. Perhaps some who fought in the long night, who remember we were all allies. Let them speak of old battles, if they come across free folk on the road. It might ease tensions. Dao. With that settled, she bid him farewell, gliding off to handle matters of castle administration, leaving John momentarily at a loss. He glanced at Ghost, who met his eyes with a silent question of his own. Let's walk, John murmured. They stepped outside into the courtyard. The swirling snow had mostly ceased, replaced by a gentle breeze. Stable hands led horses to drink at a trough near the main gate, their breath steaming in the cold air. The blacksmith's hammer rang from a forge that glowed with orange heat, and a handful of guards trained with practice swords. Seeing them, John felt a pang of nostalgia for days when he had sparred with Robb, or watched Arya slip away to practice with her thin blade. The ghosts of memory lingered behind every corner of Winterfell. He made his way to the gate, nodding at the guards, who stood aside to let him pass. He wanted a glimpse of the broader landscape. The snow-covered fields, the winding road leading to the distant villages that fed the castle with grain and supplies. Ghost padded beside him, tail held high. John walked until he reached the outskirts, where low stone walls marked the farmland. He found a spot near a gnarled tree to stop and gaze out across the wide expanse. It struck him how quiet the world could be in winter, how the hush fell over the fields and trees, muffling everything. He tried to imagine the roads that would soon be filled with lords, knights, bannermen, all converging on Winterfell to decide the fate of a realm that did not yet exist. Could he persuade them all to accept this alliance? Could the free folk truly live without conflict alongside the North? Uncertainty gnawed at him, but he also felt a sense of rightness, that this was where his path had been leading all along. He murmured to Ghost, "We've come far. Do you think we can make it work?" The dire wolf merely flicked an ear, eyes scanning the horizon. John let out a slow breath. He didn't expect an answer. In truth, he wasn't certain what answer he wanted. Yet the memory of Tormund's faith, Sansa's faith, stirred him to keep trying. By midday, John returned to the castle for a quick meal. Servants in the great hall had set out cold cuts of meat, bread and cheese for the household. He took a seat near the fire, ignoring the curious stares. Ghost lay at his feet, muzzle resting on crossed paws. As John finished a piece of bread, a familiar voice made him turn. Lord Bolton, the new Bolton, stood behind him, accompanied by 2 retainers. He was a broad-shouldered man, with a thick beard that partially concealed the shape of his jaw. "Jon Snow," he said, inclining his head in greeting. "Do you have a moment?" John finished chewing, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and nodded. "Of course." He gestured at the bench across from him. "Sit." The man hesitated, likely aware of how the Bolton name sat uncomfortably in this castle. But he lowered himself carefully, while his retainer stood at a respectful distance. "I know the Queen wants me to keep an open mind about your proposition," he began, voice even. "But I have concerns. My father, or rather, the man who raised me, once told me stories of how the free folk raided his lands, stole cattle, burned villages. The people living on the fringes still speak of them like bogeymen." John studied the man's face. He saw a certain earnestness beneath the name and bloodline. "We all carry old wounds," John acknowledged. "But I have fought alongside the free folk. They've changed. Or perhaps it's we who have changed. At Hardhome, they lost thousands to the dead. They know the cost of division." Lord Bolton ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not dismissing your words, but if I support this plan, I have to reassure my own people they won't wake to find wildlings stealing off with their children or livestock. Perhaps you could help me by showing them proof of the free folks' goodwill." John considered. "When Tormund arrives, you'll see for yourself. He's blunt, but not a savage. He can speak to their intentions far better than I can. For now, I can tell you that many free folk families are settled peacefully, minding their hunts, building shelters for winter, hoping not to be disturbed." Bolton's expression was thoughtful. "I'd like to meet Tormund then. If I can convince my people we're safe, I'll be more likely to lend my full support at the council. And from what I gather, Lady Serwyn and some others share my concerns. No offense, Jon Snow, but your word alone might not be enough." John nodded, offering a faint smile. "None taken. I understand. You'll have that chance soon. The Queen plans to host them here. A proper introduction for everyone. I promise you, Tormund is more likely to clasp your hand and drink your ale than cut your throat." That drew a grim laugh from Bolton. We'll see how he feels about the Bolton name. John couldn't deny the man had a point. The name brought back terrible memories. The flayed man's sigil, the torment inflicted on so many, including Sansa and Theon. But the main line of that house was gone, and those who'd inherited had little choice but to rebrand themselves as loyal vassals. Perhaps, like the free folk, they deserved a chance to leave old horrors behind. When Bolton took his leave, John felt a small surge of hope. For all the baggage the name carried, that conversation had been civil, even constructive. If a Bolton could be swayed, maybe the rest were not so far-fetched. Still, it would come down to how the free folk presented themselves, and how well they could reassure these lords that the new kingdom would not turn on them. Rising from the table, John stretched, quietly praising Ghost for lying still during the exchange. He decided to head to the training yard, if only to release some tension by handling a practice sword. It had been too long since he'd sparred in a formal yard, and the memory of it tugged at him with a certain nostalgia. He made his way there, weaving through corridors until he emerged into a snow-dusted space enclosed by high walls. Racks of wooden swords and shields stood along the perimeter, and a handful of young squires circled each other under the supervision of an older knight. The knight paused as John appeared, inclining his head in respect. "Lord Snow, come to see if these lads can handle a blade." John gave a modest smile. "Just passing through. Thought I might see if my arm still remembers the old forms." The knight looked intrigued. "Care to show them a thing or two? They've heard stories about the man who slew White Walkers." John considered briefly. He had never been one to seek glory in training yards. It was always more about discipline than showing off. Still, a demonstration might help ease the tension that hovered around Winterfell, proving that Jon Snow was as human as any man, not some lofty figure beyond reach. "All right, but I'm out of practice." He removed his cloak, and after a moment's thought, set it on a bench where Ghost promptly settled beside it. Then John chose a wooden sword from the rack. Decent weight, balanced enough. The young squires, a mix of boys and a tall girl with her hair braided, lined up in anticipation. Their wide eyes gave John a pang of recollection, remembering when he was their age, trying to prove himself worthy in the yard. One of the older squires, a lad named Willem, stepped forward. He was lanky, with keen brown eyes and a posture that indicated some training. "I'll try," he said, gripping his wooden sword. John offered a small nod of encouragement. The others backed away, forming a loose circle in the snow. The older knight crossed his arms, clearly curious to witness the exchange. Willem circled warily, raising his sword high. John shifted into a stance, knees bent, blade angled diagonally. He'd been taught by Sir Roderick Castle once upon a time, had honed his craft with the likes of Corin half-hand beyond the wall. Even if it had been ages since a formal spar, the rhythms returned quickly. Willem lunged, half hesitating as if uncertain whether to commit. John stepped aside with fluid ease, letting the blade swish past. He gently tapped the boy's arm with his own sword, not hard enough to bruise, but enough to show a missed guard. "Keep the point in front," John advised quietly. "And mind your balance. If you overextend, you leave your flank open." Willem flushed, determined not to make the same mistake twice. He returned to guard, then thrust again. This time, John parried, meeting the wooden blade with a satisfying crack. The boy attempted a follow-up slash, but John stepped in close, flicking the blade aside and lightly placing his sword tip against the boy's ribs. "Close, but too predictable," John said, stepping back. "Vary your angles. Don't rely on a single line of attack." Willem stared, breathing a little ragged from the effort, then dipped his head in respect. The other squires murmured amongst themselves. One of them, a heavier-set youth, gave Willem a jeering grin, as if to say he could do better. But when John turned his gaze on him, the boy's grin vanished. At the knight's prompting, 2 more squires took turns. John guided them through basic parries, footwork, and strategic feints. Each time, he offered gentle instruction. Some part of him recalled how a good teacher in the yard could shape a boy's entire future. After a time, all 3 squires stood panting, clearly impressed, and perhaps a little humbled. The knight applauded quietly. "Well handled, Lord Snow. If you've a moment, could you demonstrate some advanced moves? These children have never seen a man who's faced the others." John felt a flicker of unease at the request. The memory of fighting White Walkers was not something he relished. the terror of their inhuman grace, the cold that seemed to seep into one's bones. But if it would inspire these young ones to train harder, to take the threat of the unknown seriously, perhaps it was worth it. Just remember, Jon began, the White Walkers fought with an otherworldly skill. A normal sword would shatter against their blades of ice. Valyrian steel or dragon glass was the only way. But your stance, your resolve, can still matter. He moved to the center of the yard, lifting the wooden sword to demonstrate a guard position. He explained how, in a real fight, he had to pivot quickly, keep his feet beneath him, never lose his nerve. He illustrated a swift overhead slash and the angled parry that had once saved him from losing an arm. The knight and squires watched, rapt. Ghost, from the bench, regarded Jon with an unreadable gaze, as if remembering those nights just as keenly. When Jon finished, he lowered the practiced sword, breath steaming in the chill. The knight seemed genuinely impressed. "Thank you, my lord. I think that's enough for now. We won't keep you from your duties any longer." Jon inclined his head, returning the wooden blade to the rack. The squires murmured thanks, some with awe in their voices. He picked up his cloak and draped it over his shoulders, giving Ghost a brief pat. As he turned to leave, the older knight said quietly, "We are lucky you're here, Lord Snow. The realm owes you more than it remembers." Jon paused, uncertain how to respond. Eventually, he just nodded, slipping away from the yard. Praise always sat awkwardly on his shoulders. In his mind, he had done what was necessary to protect the living. He had also made mistakes. The realm might owe him nothing or everything, depending on which historian you ask. Better to focus on the task at hand. He spent the remainder of the afternoon conferring with some of the castle staff about the journey north. Sansa Stewart provided the names of a dozen men who had served in the wars. Jon selected a handful he recognized. Steady fighters who had encountered free folk before and wouldn't overreact to minor provocations. He also requested 2 wagons with supplies, in case Tormund or others needed an escort back with families or goods. It was uncertain how large a delegation might come from beyond the wall. By the time evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Jon found himself in the library, a place he had rarely lingered as a boy. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound tomes, scrolls, and dusty manuscripts. The hush in the library was restful, broken only by the occasional rustle of pages or the scuff of a maester's slippers. Jon sought out Maester Tybalt, who was hunched over a table, scribing some letters. "Maester," Jon greeted. "I was wondering if you had any records of the free folk, historical accounts or treaties." Tybalt looked up, blinking through his reading glasses. Some old documents, though hardly what one might call official treaties. There are accounts from various Lord Commanders of the Night's Watch, referencing attempts at peace or else detailing raids. Much of it is scattered or incomplete. But I can gather what we have if you'd like." Jon nodded, pulling out a chair. "I'd appreciate it. I'm looking for any precedent that might convince the Northern Lords this is not entirely unprecedented madness." A faint smile curved Maester's lips. "Yes, well, forging a brand new kingdom beyond the wall is quite a departure from the usual. Still, let's see what we can find." He rose from his seat, moving to one of the shelves. Ghost, who had curled up near the doorway, lifted his head to watch. The Maester perused titles in a careful manner, occasionally pulling a volume to check. After a few minutes, he returned with a short stack of parchment-bound texts. "Here," Tybalt said, placing them on the table. "Most are written from the perspective of the Night's Watch. 1 or 2 mention attempts by King Beyond the Wall, like Bale the Bard or Raymond Redbeard, to negotiate or unify their people. None ended well in the old days, either the Watch or the Stark Lords of Winterfell. That was a different time. But that was a different time." Jon thanked him, settling to read. Tybalt returned to his writing, occasionally glancing over curiously. Jon skimmed accounts of raids that escalated into open conflict, recollections of how free folk refused to bend the knee. He found mention of Mance Raiders gathering, an event he himself had been part of. The official Night's Watch record described Mance's attempt to unite 100 clans and more, seeking passage through the wall to escape the others. Jon read the words with a mix of nostalgia and sadness, remembering how it had all played out. Betrayal, bloodshed, the looming threat that overshadowed everything. Despite the bleakness, it reminded him that unifying the free folk was not new. The difference now was the potential acceptance from the realm itself, or at least from the north, rather than outright denial. If Mance had had Sansa's support, if the Lords of Winterfell had embraced the notion, perhaps so many lives could have been spared. He set the parchment aside after an hour, eyes tired, mind churning. Tybalt cleared his throat softly. Learn anything of interest? Jon rubbed his forehead. Only that what we're trying has never been done with peaceful intentions on both sides. There's always been mistrust or war overshadowing the negotiations. Daemon? Tybalt inclined his head. Which means you have no direct model to follow, and perhaps that's for the best. You're forging something new, not bound by the mistakes of the past. Jon rose, collecting the parchments. Thank you, Maester. I might quote a few bits when the time comes, if only to show how dire things were when we never tried peace. Tybalt gave a small smile. It may help. Sometimes, lords need reminders that every war started because no one believed another path was possible. Let's hope they see reason this time. Then the chin. Jon left the library, returning to his chamber by way of a side corridor that offered a quiet route. Servants carrying candles passed him, politely stepping aside. Torches burned low, making the shadows on the walls flicker like restless spirits. Ghost stayed close, unruffled, though his ears flicked at every distant clang or murmur of conversation. In his room, Jon found a fresh pitcher of water, a new set of folded garments, and the embers of a small fire in the hearth. He placed the parchments on the table, intending to glance through them once more after he ate. Then, remembering he hadn't had supper, he decided to head back to the Great Hall, or at least the kitchens, to find something before turning in. As he made his way there, Sansa appeared from the opposite end of the corridor, accompanied by a single guard carrying a lantern. She paused when she saw Jon, excusing the guard to wait a short distance away. "Are you free now?" she asked. "I was about to head to my solar for a light meal. I'd prefer not to dine alone. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Jon agreed readily, and they walked together through a short hallway, up a spiral staircase, and into the small solar where Sansa often took her private meals. It was a cozy chamber with a fireplace that emitted a pleasant heat. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood near the hearth, and a few shelves held account books, maps, and personal tokens. Sansa's wolf pelt cloak was draped over the back of one chair. She motioned for Jon to sit, and a servant quietly brought in a tray of bread, roasted vegetables, and steaming broth. The aroma of thyme and garlic drifted in the warm air. When they were settled, and the servant had quietly departed, Sansa leaned forward slightly, speaking in a low tone that carried a tinge of urgency. "I received a raven this evening from someone who claims to be speaking for House Glover. It's not from the official lord, apparently he's ill. It's from his heir, who states they're reluctant to attend any council that includes wildlings. He cites old grievances, and he's not the only one." Another message came from a lesser branch of the Tallhearts with similar concerns. "Medimtai." Jon listened, frowning. "They're refusing to come altogether?" She brushed her hair over her shoulder. "Not an outright refusal, but it's close to that. They used words like discomfort and we see little reason to break bread with the enemies of old. It's an excuse. They're on the fence, at best." Jon rubbed his jaw, feeling the bristles there. "We need them. The Glovers especially. They're influential. Oh, if they don't come, it might embolden others to stay away." "Menis." Sansa nodded, reaching for a piece of bread. "Exactly. Which is why I might need you to send a raven yourself, or to have a personal messenger deliver a letter. Something that appeals to their sense of honor, reminding them of the last war. If it comes from you, it might carry more weight than if I simply command them. Especially if you reference times you fought for them or with them." Jon exhaled, trying to recall details that might sway the Glovers. They had been part of the force that retook Winterfell from Ramsay Bolton. Lord Glover was there when we marched on Winterfell. He saw free folk on the field, fighting and dying. Perhaps I can remind him of that." Sansa's gaze flickered with approval. "Good. The letter should be direct. Acknowledge their losses, but also stress that forging a new alliance can prevent future bloodshed. If we approach them with respect, they might reconsider." He nodded, picking up his spoon to taste the broth. It was savory, warming. "I'll draft something tonight. Will you send it on one of your swiftest horses or ravens?" She tore off a bit of bread. "We'll send both a rider and a raven. I don't want them to have any excuse about messages getting lost." A brief silence followed, filled by the crackle of the fire. Jon took another spoonful, letting the flavors anchor him. It was easy to forget to eat or rest when so much weighed on him, but he needed strength for the days ahead. Sansa sipped from a cup of mulled wine. "I remember how they refused to support us at first, just before the Battle of the Bastards. They only came around later. They're proud, stubborn, and slow to forgive. I suspect they still harbor resentment for the times the free folk harassed their border villages." Jon nodded ruefully. "We'll have to wear them down with reason, or at least a sense of practicality. If they understand that continuing to see the free folk as enemies might cost them future allies, that might sway them." She set her cup down and regarded Jon earnestly. "You seem calmer these days, even in the face of resistance. Once you might have brooded for hours about the injustice of it. Now you accept it as part of the task." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "I've learned that brooding doesn't change anyone's mind. Action does. Besides, if I've learned anything north of the Wall, it's that you can't force a man to see sense. You can only show him. If he chooses to remain blind, then that's on him. But I still have to try." Sansa reached across the small table, placing her hand over Jon's briefly. Her touch was light and cool. "I'm glad you're here," she said, voice quiet. "I'd never be able to do this alone." Jon squeezed her hand gently, then withdrew, suddenly self-conscious under her warm gaze. "We stand a better chance together. And maybe, if this works, it'll be a model for the rest of Westeros. Or at least a sign that we aren't doomed to keep repeating old mistakes." "Disimo." She nodded. They finished their meal with sparse conversation, each lost in thought. The crackle of the fire provided a soothing undertone, and for a time, Jon could almost forget the looming tensions. It felt almost like family, a brother and sister sharing a meal. Yet the burdens of leadership hovered around them like ghosts. Afterward, they parted ways. Sansa remained in the Solar to review more letters, while Jon took a lantern from a servant and headed back down the corridors to his chamber. Ghost padded silently behind, as ever. The castle was quieter now. Many had turned in or gathered in smaller rooms to play dice and share stories before bed. Jon passed a group of guards at a stairwell, who saluted him stiffly, still unsure how to treat the man who was once a brother of the Night's Watch, and might soon be called a king beyond the Wall. Once in his room, he lit a few candles and sat at the small wooden desk. Ghost lay down near the hearth, curling his tail around his paws. Jon opened a blank parchment, dipped a quill in ink, and considered his words carefully. It had been a long time since he'd written a formal letter of persuasion. He usually left such tasks to others, but this was too important to delegate. He began with a respectful salutation to Lord Glover and his heir, acknowledging their rightful concerns and past hurts, then moved on to recall how they had stood beside the Starks in the final push to reclaim Winterfell. He subtly reminded them that free folk had aided that victory, giving their lives on the battlefield. He stressed the opportunity for lasting peace, and how the realm had changed since the war with the dead. Finally, he concluded with a personal plea. That if they trusted Jon Snow enough to fight with him once, they should trust him again to find a path that spares future generations from conflict. The quill scratched across the parchment, leaving lines of dark ink that shimmered in the lantern light. When he finished, he read it over twice, making small edits to the phrasing, ensuring he struck the right balance of humility and conviction. Then he set it aside to dry, adding a pinch of sand to quicken the process. Leaning back in the chair, he glanced at Ghost. The dire wolf watched him with half-lidded eyes, as though lulled by the hush of the night. Joan's own eyelids felt heavy. Outside the window slit, the wind had picked up, rattling a shutter somewhere in the corridor. The castle settled into nocturnal stillness. He remembered he also wanted to write to Tormund, letting him know to expect Jon within a few days. But that message could wait until morning. Tormund likely wouldn't read it anyway. He preferred direct conversation, and half the time letters got lost or went unanswered among the free folk. Jon felt a pang of longing for the simple directness of Tormund's approach. No politics, no forging alliances with dozens of suspicious lords, just a straightforward, "Aye or no, we fight together." But the world seldom conformed to Tormund's ease. They needed a more delicate dance now. Jon crossed to the bed, peeled off his boots, and sank onto the mattress. Ghost watched, then rose and padded over, flopping onto the floor near the bed, close enough that Jon could drop a hand to scratch behind the direwolf's ears. The warmth of the flames in the hearth lulled him as he lay back, arms resting on his chest. He thought of the journey he'd soon make, the gathering that would follow, the fragile hope that Sansa and he were nurturing like a small spark in a winter gale. If the wind blew too fiercely, it could snuff out that spark, plunging them back into the cold cynicism of old hatreds. Yet if they sheltered it and fed it properly, the flame might grow into a beacon that would guide future generations. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint thud of his heartbeat. A new kingdom, a place of ice and fire, shaped by those who had once been enemies. He pictured Tormund's broad grin, Sansa's determined gaze, the uncertain but hopeful faces of northern lords. Maybe, if the gods willed it, those faces would become a tapestry of unity, rather than conflict. Sleep claimed him in fits and starts, broken by half-formed dreams of a great hall filled with free folk and northerners alike, all wearing mismatched furs and armor, each of them brandishing cups of ale instead of weapons. He heard laughter echoing off stone walls, saw banners that combined the direwolf sigil with some symbol of the free folk, a rampant mammoth or a rising sun over snow. Then the dream shifted, and the hall grew dark, the warmth fading into an icy wind that swept through the corridors, snuffing out torches. He heard distant howls, the shriek of ravens, and caught a glimpse of shadows moving across the walls, too tall and too thin to be human. He jerked awake, heart pounding. The chamber was still, the fire reduced to embers that cast a ruddy glow on the floor. Ghost sat upright, ears pointed, sensing Jon's sudden movement. Jon exhaled, pushing sweaty hair back from his forehead. Just a dream. But dreams too often carried echoes of warnings, hints of unresolved terrors from the long night. He rose, stirring the fire back to life with a few sticks. The flickering flames reassured him somewhat, chasing away the gloom. Outside the wind hissed, but nothing more. When he finally lay down again, he forced himself to steady his breathing, letting each exhale loosen the knot of tension in his chest. Ghost returned to his curled position, confident that whatever startled Jon had passed. Eventually, dawn came, painting the sky with a pale light that seeped into the chamber. The day began similarly to the last, a flurry of hushed conversations, final checks on his traveling party, and updates from Sansa, about which lords might arrive sooner than expected. Jon sealed the letter to the Glovers with a wax imprint of a direwolf, though it felt strange to use that seal after a lifetime of being the bastard. Sansa had insisted it was necessary to convey unity. He gave the letter to a trusted courier, along with instructions to press on quickly. Next, he penned a shorter note to Tormund, scrawling that he would ride north in 2 days, and hoped to meet near the old camps, where they could travel back together. The day passed swiftly, a churn of small tasks and preparations. Jon ensured the wagons were stocked with blankets, provisions, and feed for the horses. He spoke with the men who would accompany him. A few recognized him from the Battle of Winterfell, greeting him warmly and pledging their loyalty. He felt a glimmer of pride in their confidence, even if he worried about the hazards they might face on the journey. By nightfall, the ravens had returned with scattered replies. A few minor lords grudgingly agreed to come, some holding out their final decision. There was no immediate word from the Glovers. Jon told himself to be patient. Travel was slow in the north during winter, and every day was unpredictable. Sansa took it in stride, balancing the weight of leading a realm and managing a new push for diplomacy. Jon admired how she juggled so many demands without complaint. The night was calmer. Jon dined briefly with a handful of castle knights in attendance in the Great Hall. They exchanged idle pleasantries about the weather and local hunts, until one knight made a passing remark about wildling devils. Jon tensed, meeting the man's gaze evenly. To his relief, another knight quickly corrected the term, pointing out that free folk had bled beside them in the last war. The first knight muttered an apology, claiming habit. But the slip reminded Jon how deep old prejudices ran. He would need to remain vigilant, especially once Tormund and the others arrived. After dinner, Jon returned to his chamber. This time, he found the night passed with fewer nightmares. The dawn brought fresh snowfall, and servants lit the corridors with extra torches to combat the gloom of overcast skies. Sansa and Jon convened again in her solar, after breaking their fast, each confirming that the party riding north would depart the following morning. Sansa insisted that Jon stay for the next day's midday meeting with a newly arrived pair of lords, the Ryswell envoy and a Tallheart representative, so that they could see Jon's face, hear a few words, and realize he was not a ghost story, but a genuine presence in Winterfell. Jon agreed. If it helped smooth the path, he'd do whatever was needed. The next midday meeting proved another small step forward. The Ryswell envoy was an older man with a hawk-like nose who regarded Jon with wary respect. He asked a few pointed questions about the free folk's numbers and how they intended to handle criminals within their ranks. Jon, as always, spoke plainly. There would be a code of justice that all recognized, though the details would need to be hammered out at the Grand Council. The man muttered that it was unorthodox but did not immediately reject the idea. The Tallheart representative, a young woman with pale hair, was more inquisitive, pressing Jon about trade possibilities. She seemed keen on the potential for acquiring furs and rare northern game that commanded high prices in the south. That line of conversation warmed her to the alliance, painting it as an economic boon rather than a threat. Jon recalled that Tormund had once boasted of enough furs to bury a giant, and wondered if that might soon become a bargaining chip. After the meeting, Sansa caught Jon's arm as the others left. They seemed cautiously open, she remarked in a low tone. Especially the Tallheart woman. If we can secure a strong trade arrangement, that might tip the scale for her house. The Ryswell is more grudging, but at least he's not threatening to walk away. Jon nodded, exhaling. It'll take more than one conversation. But yes, it's progress. By the time the sun hung low in the sky, Jon had handled all pressing matters for the day. He made one final sweep through the courtyard, checking on the horses and wagons that would set out with him in the morning. The stablemaster assured him all was in readiness. The men chosen for the journey seemed in good spirits, if a bit anxious about traveling so far north. Jon tried to put them at ease, explaining that the free folk camps were not as wild as rumor suggested. Some had already visited Tormund's settlement to trade in a limited capacity, finding the free folk more neighborly than expected. That evening, over a simple supper of warm stew in a smaller dining alcove, Sansa joined Jon at the table. They ate quietly for a while, the tension of the upcoming departure heavy between them. At last, she set down her spoon, meeting Jon's eyes across the flickering light of a single lantern. "Travel safely," she said, "and remind Tormund that we welcome them as guests. I don't want them to arrive armed to the teeth and create panic among the lords." Jon half smiled. "Tormund is never without a weapon of some sort, but I'll make sure he knows not to march in like an invading army. He'll likely bring a token escort, a few reliable fighters, maybe some of their leaders, but they won't come spoiling for a fight." Sansa nodded, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I'll do what I can here, smoothing ruffled feathers so that when you all arrive, the environment is ready for open talks. We need to maintain calm." He reached across the table, giving her hand a brief, reassuring squeeze. "We'll manage. We always do." She offered a tiny, grateful smile. Then she withdrew her hand and stood, indicating that she had to attend to one last duty before nightfall. Jon watched her go, reflecting on how far they'd both come from the children they once were in these same walls. They were forging alliances now, shaping the future of a realm a task that seemed unreal in some ways, yet so vital. With the stew finished, John made a final pass along Winterfell's corridors, checking with the men who would accompany him north at first light. He shared a few words of encouragement, cautioning them to stay alert but not to provoke. Their faces reflected various degrees of readiness, from calm acceptance to mild nervousness. A tall soldier named Gendrick admitted he'd never seen a wildling face-to-face before, only heard stories. John reassured him that the free folk were merely people like any others, though prouder, more blunt, and often driven by a fierce love of their freedom. At last, John returned to his chamber, where Ghost waited, seemingly in tune with the fact that a journey was imminent. John packed what little he needed, a few changes of clothes, a bedroll, extra gloves, flint and steel, basic supplies in case the wagons got separated. He also tucked a newly penned note to Tormund in his saddlebag, in case they crossed paths unexpectedly, or if Tormund was not in the usual camp. Then he settled onto his bed, determined to rest despite the swirl of thoughts. Ghost curled at his feet, and John let the lull of the fire in the hearth guide him into a dreamless slumber. Dawn came, veiled in pale light. A sense of departure electrified the courtyard. Horses were saddled, wagons loaded, men readied with cloaks and weapons. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes, as though the sky itself blessed the venture. Sansa stood near the stables, dressed in a thick cloak, lined with gray fur, flanked by a handful of guards. She nodded to each man as he approached, giving them a measured look that told them she was entrusting them with this mission. John emerged with Ghost at his side. He wore layered black and gray garments, practical for the cold. A sword hung at his hip, not Longclaw, which he had left with the free folk some time ago, but a strong steel blade from Winterfell's armory. He approached Sansa, noticing the faint worry in her eyes, though her expression remained poised. She lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Good luck. Bring them back safely, and come back safely yourself. We've lost too many Starks, Jon Snow. I'd rather not lose another." "Nay?" He offered a small, earnest smile. "I'll do my best, my queen." For a moment, it seemed she might say more, but then she only nodded, stepping aside so that John could mount his horse. Ghost stood at the foot of the saddle, seemingly intent on running alongside. The men followed suit, forming a loose line behind the wagons. Sansa raised a hand in farewell, and the gates opened wide, allowing them passage onto the snow-covered road that stretched north. The horses trotted forward, their breath steaming in the chill. The wagon wheels crunched on ice. Guards at the gate saluted. Ghost broke into an easy lope beside Jon's horse, keen eyes scanning the snowy fields. Jon cast a final glance over his shoulder at Winterfell's towers, the rising smoke from its chimneys, and the figure of Sansa on the ramparts. Then he fixed his gaze on the horizon. They would make for Castle Black first, break for a night or two if necessary, then press into the lands beyond the wall. Jon hoped the Night's Watch wouldn't complicate matters. The few brothers who remained there might still resent the free folks' presence. But if all went well, they'd cross into Tormund's domain within a week, weather permitting. The small column moved steadily, forging northward under a sky of drifting gray clouds. Occasional gusts of wind sent flurries spinning around them, but the day remained surprisingly calm otherwise. Jon found himself scanning every rise and drift of snow, half expecting to see shapes or hear the echo of old battles. But the land was still, slumbering under winter's blanket. As they traveled, he spoke with the men in quieter moments, sharing stories of how the free folk lived, how Tormund teased him relentlessly, how a sense of raw humor and hospitality often emerged once trust was earned. Some men smiled, amused by the anecdotes. Others listened gravely, as though memorizing every detail in case they needed to adapt quickly. By midday, they reached the outskirts of a small village that served as a modest rest stop between Winterfell and the ruins of the wall. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys. A local inn stood at the edge of the main road, offering shelter and hot meals for weary travelers. Jon decided they should pause for a short break, allowing the horses to drink and the men to stretch their legs. The road would only grow harsher from here. They tethered the horses outside the inn while Jon sent two men inside to buy provisions. Ghost remained near John, regarding the cluster of villagers who peered out from behind shutters or from the corners of the street. One older man, stooped and bundled in thick furs, approached cautiously. "You're riding north?" the man asked, eyeing the wagons. "Not many do these days. You'll find little up there but cold and wolves." John gave a mild shrug. "We have business north. There's nothing to fear from us." The man hummed. "Might not be you we should fear. The free folk wander further south of the wall than they used to. Some of them raided a trapper's cabin a few months back, or so the story goes." John stiffened. "Did anyone confirm that?" The old man scratched his chin. "Maybe it was just bandits. Hard to say. But folk talk. Rumors make their way through these parts. Just be wary." "Me?" John nodded politely, though inside he felt a ripple of concern. If rumors of free folk raids had reached these villages, it could complicate the alliance. He made a mental note to ask Tormund if any rogue clans were acting without the main leader's sanction. By the time they resumed the journey, the sun had dipped behind thick clouds, casting the world in a somber half-light. The horses plodded onward, breaths coming in rhythmic puffs. Occasionally, one of the men would raise a question about the free folk or about the terrain ahead, and John answered as best he could. He knew from experience that the land beyond the wall could be treacherous even without direct threats. Hidden crevasses, sudden storms, or icy lakes that broke under a horse's weight. That night, they camped under a copse of tall pines, forming a ring of wagons and tents. The men built a fire, cooked simple fare, and sipped hot broth to ward off the chill. Ghost circled the perimeter, a silent guardian, ears pricked for danger. John made a final round before bedding down, checking on the horses, ensuring everyone had enough furs. The night sky was overcast, but the glow of the snow gave it an eerie luminescence. He couldn't see the moon, yet the landscape retained a faint silver sheen. He tried to sleep, huddled beneath a thick cloak. The memory of winter nights spent in the far north filled him with cautious nostalgia. So often, he had lain awake listening for the scrape of white claws or the eerie cries of ice creatures. Tonight, at least, only the wind muttered through the pine needles overhead. Ghost dozed near him, exuding a comforting warmth. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted into dreamless rest. At dawn, they broke camp quickly, eager to continue. The road began to slope upward, winding through rocky passes that led to what remained of the wall. John instructed the men to keep their eyes peeled. Sometimes, smugglers or outlaws set up ambushes in these narrow stretches, but they encountered no one. Even the wildlife seemed scarce. Only the occasional crow perched on a branch, cawing at the travelers before fluttering off in a flurry of feathers. By late afternoon, the wall's ruined silhouette appeared on the horizon. A jagged line of ice and rubble that seemed both ancient and wounded. Memory surged through John, and he felt a pang at how drastically the once imposing barrier had been undone. Great sections had collapsed when the undead dragon unleashed its fires of blue. Now, massive chunks of ice lay strewn about like fallen monoliths, and the passages that remained were patched by crude timber or left open. They pressed on. Castle Black came into view, perched near a segment of the broken wall that still stood, albeit precariously. Smoke rose from a single chimney, a testament to the small garrison that kept watch there. John wondered how many men remained, perhaps fewer than 10, given last reports. Ghost bounded forward, nose testing the air. He likely smelled familiar scents from their last visit. As they neared the fortress gates, a horn blew once, echoing off the broken ramparts. John held up a hand, signaling his party to slow. The gates creaked open, and a black-clad figure emerged. A ranger with a worn cloak. John recognized Will, the man who had greeted him on his last visit. Will's face broke into a small smile when he saw John at the head of the column. "Jon Snow," he called, stepping aside to let them pass. "You brought more people this time." John guided his horse forward, returning the man's nod. "We're on our way north. The Queen in the north is hosting a great council soon, and we need to invite some friends beyond the wall." Will eyed the wagons, then the armed men. "Friends, you say? Times have changed indeed. Welcome to Castle Black." such as it is. Nempimbaten. They entered the courtyard. It felt emptier than ever, half the buildings in disrepair or collapsed from previous battles. Only a few stable stalls remained, and the main hall looked near deserted. Will explained that a handful of Black brothers were out hunting, leaving just 2 or 3 behind to keep the fires going and watch the gate. It was a far cry from the once bustling fortress John remembered. "We won't linger too long," John assured him. "We need a place to shelter for the night, if you can spare it. Tomorrow we head through the breach." "Noran," Will agreed, leading them to the stables. The men busied themselves unsaddling horses, distributing feed, and setting up bedrolls. Inside the main hall, a single hearth provided minimal warmth. Some planks had been nailed over holes in the roof, but the wind whistled through cracks, causing the fire to sputter. John offered to share supplies with the night's watchmen, who gratefully accepted any help they could get. It was clear they lacked provisions and manpower to maintain the old stronghold properly. That night, John and his men assembled around the hearth, swapping stories with Will and the few remaining Black brothers. One was a skinny youth named Braden, who confessed he'd only joined the watch because a lord had given him the choice of that or prison. Another was an older man, Lark, who coughed frequently and seemed weary beyond his years. Their meager group was doing what they could, patrolling the immediate surroundings, occasionally scouting beyond the wall to ensure no hidden threats lurked. But it felt more symbolic than practical. John asked if they'd encountered any free folk. Braden admitted they saw small hunting parties from time to time, mostly ignoring each other. Lark claimed that once or twice, a band of free folk had offered to trade, leaving some game in exchange for metal scraps. It seemed peaceful enough, though distrust lingered. As the flames danced in the dim hall, Will turned to John. "You once led us. What do you see for the future of the Watch, if the free folk become an official kingdom?" John looked into the fire, remembering his vow. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins." He felt a pang of nostalgia and a sense of distance, as though those words belonged to another life. The watch's purpose was always to guard against threats from beyond the wall. If a new kingdom forms there, perhaps you'll guard against anything else lurking further north. Or perhaps you'll find a new calling. There are old legends of creatures yet undiscovered. But the truth is, the realm changes. The watch must adapt or fade. Mandesari. Will shared a glance with the others. "We can't hold the wall like we once did, but we can still be a refuge for criminals seeking a second chance. We can still patrol, keep an eye out for trouble. But yes, we're not the force we once were." John nodded, quietly respecting their resolve. Even in near irrelevance, they clung to the vestiges of duty. After a time, the men turned to lighter topics, trading jokes about the cold and who snored the loudest. John excused himself eventually, stepping out to check on the wagons. The courtyard lay under a moonlit sky, the remains of the wall looming overhead like jagged teeth. Ghost padded at his side, sniffing the rubble. He caught sight of the breach in the wall, a massive gap where ice had crashed to the ground, creating a ramp of broken chunks that led north. The path was treacherous, but navigable with care. Tomorrow they would ascend it, leaving behind the last vestige of the 7 kingdoms to enter the true north. The thought filled John with equal parts excitement and apprehension. He found a quiet corner to relieve himself, then returned to the main hall, spreading his bedroll near the fire. Ghost settled beside him, ears flicking at the night's sounds. The old nightmares did not come this time. Exhaustion took him quickly, lulling him into a deep slumber. They set out at first light, climbing through the breach as the wind whipped snow around them in swirling gusts. The going was slow. Horses slipped on ice, and men had to dismount to guide the beasts carefully up and over the piles of rubble. Ghost bounded ahead, agile as ever, pausing on higher ground to look back as if urging them onward. Eventually, they crested the broken ridge and descended into the far side, the land that had once been sealed away by the wall's towering presence. Here, the wind felt sharper, the air more biting. The vast tundra stretched out, dotted with scraggly pine clusters and rocky outcroppings. In the distance, hazy shapes of hills loomed. John shielded his eyes, scanning the horizon for any sign of free folk scouts. They might watch travelers from a distance, deciding whether to approach or vanish. He knew Tormund would likely have posted lookouts. The company pressed onward, forming a rough column on the snowy plains. Occasionally, one of the men muttered about the cold or the emptiness. Ghost jogged beside Jon's horse, seemingly invigorated by the open space. They passed through a scattering of old wildling camps. Circles of stone, remnants of old fires, animal bones. Most looked abandoned, though the presence of fresh tracks suggested not all were deserted. By midday, they paused to let the horses rest, feeding them from the wagon supplies. The men huddled against the wind to eat dried meat and bread, stamping their feet to keep warm. Jon surveyed the horizon again, alert for movement. At last, he spotted faint shapes on a distant rise. Figures, perhaps half a dozen, silhouetted against the sky. They lingered a moment, then vanished behind a drift. Jon pointed them out to the men. Free folk scouts, likely. They'll report our presence. If Tormund is nearby, he'll come to greet us, or at least send an envoy. They continued on, aware they were being watched. The terrain grew uneven, small valleys hidden behind snow-laden ridges. Late in the afternoon, they reached a broad, shallow valley where the wind subsided a fraction. Suddenly, a series of figures appeared from behind a rise, moving toward them in a loose line. All wore furs and carried weapons. Spears, axes, shortbows. Jon signaled his men to hold steady, keep swords sheathed. A tall form at the center let out a bellowing laugh that carried across the snow. Well, look who's come crawling back from the Kneelers' castle. Jon grinned, recognizing that booming voice. Tormund Giantsbane, he called, urging his horse forward. He raised a hand in greeting as Tormund closed the distance, flanked by a handful of rugged-looking free folk. Behind them, Jon glimpsed a few women and older men, all studying the newcomers with guarded curiosity. Tormund stomped up to Jon's horse, reached out, and seized Jon's forearm in a hearty grip. About time, he said, eyes sparkling with mirth beneath his thick red beard. I was starting to think you'd grown too soft to handle the cold. Jon dismounted, ignoring the swirl of wind that tried to tug his cloak away. Soft. I've been in Winterfell, Tormund, not Dorne. It's cold enough there too. Tormund barked another laugh, slapping Jon's shoulder. Ha! Suppose you're right. But it doesn't have the same sting as this land. So you've brought an army, have you? Jon shook his head. Just an escort. We're here to invite you, and anyone else who'll come, to Winterfell. The Queen is convening a council to discuss a new arrangement. Tormund's bright eyes flicked over Jon's shoulder at the wagons and men. A new arrangement, eh? That the fancy way of saying the free folk get to rule themselves, and the Southerners leave us be? Jon smiled wryly. Something like that. But it's more than just leaving you be. We want an alliance. A recognized kingdom north of the Wall. So no one can claim you're criminals or raiders. Trade agreements, mutual defense, the works. The free folk behind Tormund exchanged curious glances. One woman spat in the snow, muttering that Kneeler treaties were worthless. Another scratched at a scar on her cheek, eyes uncertain. Tormund, however, grinned broadly. Jon Snow, always trying to fix the unfixable. But I like the sound of it. He jabbed a thumb at his own chest. You know I'm with you. I'll come and bring a few leaders so we can speak as one. Men. Jon exhaled, relief mingling with the cold air. Thank you. We'll travel together. Let's find a suitable place to make camp before dark. It's a long way back, and the roads won't be easy. Tormund's gaze lingered on the northern men. A few free folk bristled, but Tormund waved them off. Relax, you lot. These are friends of Crow, which makes them friends of ours, unless they prove otherwise. Jon introduced his men, each stepping forward in turn, slightly tense, but following Jon's lead. Tormund clasped forearms with the older ones who had fought in the long night. Shared memories of that battle softened the stances, warming them more than the sparse sunlight ever could. Tormund's boisterous presence broke barriers, exactly as Jon had hoped. With that, the combined group set off, free folk scouts leading them to a sheltered hollow nestled between two ridges. They pitched tents, built fires, and began the delicate dance of coexisting in close quarters. Jon noticed a few uneasy glances, but mostly the men kept their distance, forging parallel camps near the same fire. As the temperature dropped and the first stars emerged overhead, Tormund produced a skin of some potent drink, passing it around with bawdy jokes that cut through the tension. The night passed with no violence, only cautious mingling. Jon found himself sitting near Tormund, discussing the details of the upcoming council. The big man listened intently, though he occasionally scratched his beard and muttered that all these lords, with their fancy words, might give him a headache. Still, he promised to keep the free folk leaders in line, provided none of the kneelers insulted them. Jon nodded, wryly stating that he'd do his best to ensure mutual respect. The wind howled over the ridges, but the crackle of the fires provided a sense of security. Ghost and a pair of lean free folk hounds guarded the perimeter, sniffing the air. Stars spread across the northern sky in dazzling splendor, hinting at a vastness beyond mortal concerns. Before drifting to sleep, Jon looked around at the mingled group. Free folk, northerners, all bound by the memory of the war for the dawn and the fragile hope of forging something new. In that moment, he allowed himself to believe they might succeed. They had come this far, bridging old hatreds and forging common cause. The next step would be to face the northern lords at Winterfell, each side wary but guided by Jon's hand, Tormund's charm, and Sansa's diplomacy. He closed his eyes to the starlight, hearing Tormund's rumbling snores and the soft murmur of men standing watch. Ghost settled beside him, a living warmth against the cold. Tomorrow, they would continue south, carrying with them the flickering promise of a new kingdom. A kingdom of ice and fire, shaped by unity instead of fear. And perhaps, if the gods were kind, that promise would catch like a spark on dry tinder, igniting a future where free folk and northerners no longer stood on opposite sides of a once impossible wall.